All right, folks, it is that time again. I hope you are all doing lovely. It is so good to see you all. Got a couple of people still working their way in. Let me get them in real quick. Let me hit this button. And we will kick this fun-filled night off. I'm just so excited to see you all. I hope y'all are as equally excited to be here in licensing land, right? Learning some fun stuff, make your brains hurt a little bit, all the good things. Let's see, y'all. Folks, as per usual, I will do what I have a tendency to do. Any questions, comments, concerns about your studying endeavors or anything thus far that I can help you out?
Yes, if you could, are you asking for the whole class?
Yeah, absolutely. No, everybody but you, Monica.
For some reason, I emailed you about this. I'm a little hung up on the whole substantive contact versus first.
Sure.
I don't know why I'm getting it, or initial. It just flipping around my brain a little bit.
Yeah. No problem. It's an important concept, so I'm happy to go over it. Also, I appreciate that on a side note, Jacob. You know, I'm always excited to see y'all. Even though y'all may not be excited for the material, it's always good to hang out with y'all. So yeah, Monica, let's talk about it. First and foremost, let's just talk about the two things that you have to be aware of and differentiate. Substantial contact is actually referred to as first substantial contact. So you don't have to confuse those two. The reason why you're probably mucking it up in your brain is because there is first substantial contact and there is initial contact. And of course, initial and first kind of synonymous a little bit. So that's where your brain can kind of try to muddy those waters. So what we said yesterday is that for every potential relationship that could arise with a buyer or seller, because it's sales transactions only, the trigger for giving them the working with real estate agents disclosure is first substantial contact, not contact in general. Let me just give you the example I gave before. If I'm a real estate broker holding an open house and somebody walks into the house, I don't have to disclose how agency works to them. Because we have not had any really substantial contact. That's why it's called first substantial contact. The first time the conversation becomes substantial. Well, what is substantial? Confidential information, price, terms, motivation, things that could be used against them in a negotiation. So if I'm in this open house and 1,000 people walk through the open house and the conversation is only ever about the features of the house, what's it's close to, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, the list price, none of that was sensitive information. I never had to give these people a working with real estate agents disclosure. Does that statement make sense?
I'm good. Right now, I'm good. I'm not confused.
Okay. So in that scenario, though, let's say, Monica, I'm holding the open house. You come in and you start telling me, that you like the house. Well, that's generic. You asked me about the house. That's generic. And then you say, well, great, Seth. I think I'd like to put an offer because I'm going through a really nasty divorce and I've got to be under contract within 6 days on a property. So as soon as you started telling me things like, well, I'm going through a nasty divorce, I'm going to say, Monica, please stop. Listen to me. I've got to go over this working with real estate agents disclosure and explain how agency representation works, Monica, so you can be protected as a consumer. And what it will basically review, right, is the different types of agency relationships. And that if you are not going to hire me, then you shouldn't tell me your secrets because then I can use them against you because then you would maintain that relationship as a customer. So that is the first substantial contact piece. For potential buyers, potential sellers in general, the second they start trying to talk to us about confidential information, we've got to stop them and we got to provide that disclosure. It is a written disclosure. It's always going to be tested that way because of the way it's a form when we have to review it and we ask them to sign it. Okay, so you're still good with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so the only other thing that's really super testable in North Carolina is the initial contact piece. But the initial contact piece only comes into play if you are already very specifically representing a buyer client. So if you, let's say, Monica, in that open house, you hire me, I become your agent, you're my buyer client. And you don't want to put an offer in on that house, but I take you to go see other houses. And then one day you call me up and you say, Seth, I want to go see this for sale by owner. And I say, okay. So the way that I'm going to schedule you to go see a for sale by owner, because they don't have an agent, is I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call that seller. And because I already represent you, the buyer, I would have to tell that seller the second they pick up the phone, initial contact. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, my name's Seth Chauncey. I'm a real estate broker representing a client, buyer of mine who is interested in your property. Please don't tell me any confidential information because I work for the buyer, not for you. And the reason we have to do that when we're already representing a buyer client talking to a seller or seller's agent is because, remember, you could be on the same team as the seller in a potential scenario as a seller sub-agent. So they need to know from the get-go that you are on the opposite team.
Gotcha. Isn't there, you said something really clever about remembering it, and I think you said disclosures are substantial contact, but agreements are initial. Like when they're referring to a disclosure, whether it be working with agents or whether the other disclosures, you were saying that that's for substantial, but then when it comes to a binding agreement, which it sounds like once you have a buyer with you, you're under some,
Yeah, so, and that's exactly right. If you're talking to somebody and there's no conflict of interest in any way, shape, and form, they may be a potential buyer, they may be a potential seller, but there's no conflict of interest, it's always going to be for substantial contact. But only if you are already under an agency agreement with a buyer and you are talking to a seller or a seller's agent, which is the automatic opposite team, that's when it's initial. And I will show you this really quick, just so you can see and kind of put it into perspective under the legal way. And we looked at this last week, I believe, but now it should hopefully feel a little bit better in everybody's heads now that I've kind of explained it a little bit more. So this is all specifically part of North Carolina rules, and even more specifically, Rule 58A.0104. Do you need to know that number? No. Do you need to know the pieces within it? Yes. And so 0104 is right here. And I'll zoom in a little bit. In every real estate sales transaction, a broker shall, at first substantial contact with prospective buyer or seller, provide the prospective buyer or seller with a copy of the publication working with real estate agents, set forth the broker's name and license number thereon, review the publication with the buyer or seller, and determine whether the agent will act as the agent of the buyer or seller in the transaction. Now, you're not actually determining any relationships there, but you're basically deciding if they're interested in going into a relationship, because remember, agency disclosures never, ever, 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 ever create an agency relationship. Only agency agreements do that. Now, it goes on to say later, in every real estate sales transaction, a broker representing a buyer shall, at the initial contact with the seller or seller's agent, disclose to the seller or seller's agent that the broker represents the buyer's interest. In addition, every real estate sales transaction other than auctions brokered, yada, yada, yada. So that's the differentiation there.
Okay. It sounds to me like the initial one, it falls into place because someone's already under some type of a binding agreement.
Yeah, but it's very specific that it is a buyer representation. The initial only comes into because think about it. Let's go back to that open house example. If I'm holding an open house and I work for ABC Realty, and let's say that it's Justin's listing, but I'm holding that open house, who do I work for?
Oh, I'm sorry. You work for the seller.
The seller. There you go. But I don't have to disclose that to you at initial contact. You see the difference? A seller's agent, a seller's agent doesn't have to disclose anything at initial contact. Only a buyer's agent would to a seller or a seller's agent. And that's because of that potential to be a seller sub-agent or a buyer's agent, which could mean we are on the same team or the opposite team.
Okay. So it's reduced to just being the buyer agent when that would kick in.
That's exactly right. Initial contact is only ever if you are already under a buyer agency agreement with a buyer and you are talking to a seller or a seller's agent about a home your buyer is interested in. That is the only time it's initial.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Excellent question. What else? Any other brain busters you folks want to talk about before we dive into this fun-filled night? No? Cool.
Ready for the learning, Seth.
Ready for the learning. I am with you. I'm ready for the teaching. I tell you, leading up to class tonight, I'm like sitting here because I've done so much today. I was like kind of nodding off, and I'm like, the good news is, like, at least my job's not boring, because if it was, I would be falling asleep right now. Thankfully, I can't do that because I have to yib-yab all night long at you fine folks and teach you stuff, so it's not really possible for me to fall asleep. But I am sleepy. Not tired. Like, not like exhausted, but sleepy for some reason. I don't know. My kids wake me up early every morning. I think that's what it is. So we're almost done with what I would call the agency contract section. Yeah, we've talked about more than agency contracts in this section, but that's really the best name for this section. We've talked about antitrust laws. Give me some examples of what would fall under those antitrust laws. What are the prohibited practice under the Sherman Antitrust Act?
Can't do group price fixing.
No price fixing? What do you say, Justin?
Boycotting.
Yeah, no boycotting, no price fixing, and no allocation of markets. All of those are exceptionally illegal. Now, I told you those meetings, like I kind of articulated to you yesterday, they're not really happening. But what would be enough to make you guilty, presumably, of price fixing?
A certain comment like saying everybody charges.
There you go. There you go. If you say everybody charges 6%, all the firms in the area, that's the going rate. That's customary. That's enough to make you guilty of price fixing, and you've got to answer the test questions that way. The generalization is brokerage fees are always negotiable. Now, whether or not you're willing to negotiate is a separate thing. It is okay to say, my firm charges this, I charge this, because they can always just go hire somebody else. That's the whole purpose of these laws, is we have competition that may offer better rates than us, which kind of keeps our prices in line. And so there's no, kind of price gouging that point. So we talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act and the laws that go into it. The other one we talked about was the no solicitation laws. What do we talk about in the solicitation laws?
National do not call.
Yeah, there you go. The do not call legislation.
Can Spam Act.
The Can Spam Act. And then I also threw one into the mix. Which one?
Junk Facts.
Yeah, Junk Facts Prevention Act. And so, of course, as a real estate broker, you have the potential to go out and solicit for business. And so if you're going to make cold calls, that's solicitation, you would need to check the do not call registry. And if they are registered on the do not call registry, then you better not call them unless it falls into one of the exemptions. I gave you a couple. What were the exemptions? When can you call somebody who is on the do not call list?
You have a personal relationship.
Personal relationship, your brother, your sister, your girlfriend, your nieces, nephews, aunts, cousins, sister.
They tell you it's okay to call them.
They personal invitation. You should retain that invitation. They say it's okay.
If you've done business with them within the last
18 months or less.
There you go. Y'all nailed it. Business relationship within the past 18 months or direct business inquiry within the past 3 months. And then I gave you one more unique one that always comes into play with a for sale by owner. What was it?
if you're calling about a listing for your buyer.
There you go. A for sale by owner is not an exemption in and of itself. If you call a for sale by owner who's on the do not call list and try to solicit their listing, you are in violation of the do not call legislation. But if you call a for sale by owner whose number is on the do not call registry because you have a buyer client actually interested in their property, that is legal. That is okay. So just be very careful on the test, okay? They may try to trip you up. Also, don't get tripped up if they ask if it's okay to call a for sale by owner. Yeah. It's only not okay if they're on the do not call list. Not every seller is on the do not call list. A lot of students get tripped up on this. Once we introduce the do not call list, they automatically have this stigma in their head. Oh, I can never call. No. If they're not on the do not call list, you can always call. There's no legality issues for calling anybody who's on the do not call list. Now, they may not like the call, but it doesn't make it illegal. So big old fines for violations of the do not call legislation, up to $11,000 on a federal level, anywhere from $500 to $5,000 on the state level. The Can Spam Act, what did it deal with?
solicitation, pornography, and
Porn. It was all about porn, pornography, and the devil's work. No, yeah. The controlling the assault of non-solicited pornography and mail act and marketing act, depending on who you ask. But it just deals with mass mailers. And when you are sending out mass email electronically, it has to contain that conspicuous opt-out or unsubscribe option on there. And then, of course, the Junk Fax Prevention Act deals with solicitation through facsimile, also called a fax. It has to have instructions on how to opt out of receiving those faxes. So we talked about those. And then we kind of ended up last night talking about different things that go into the pre-listing meeting. Now, some of this stuff will circle back around when we get into the closing a sales transaction section. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But I will just kind of remind you, we looked at the residential square footage guidelines to wrap up the night last night. And so in North Carolina, the 3 criteria for being considered living square footage and can be included in the total number of living area is what? What were the 3 criteria?
it has to be heated. It has to be finished like the rest of the house. And the ceiling has to be, 7 feet tall?
7 feet, but that's part of the finished.
Directly accessible from other living areas.
Directly accessible from other heated living area. That's exactly right. Those are the 3 criteria. Now, I'm going to throw another interesting one into the mix. Folks, when we talked about public and private land use controls, under public land use controls, there was building codes. What were building codes? This is where we're starting to build layers and I'm tying thoughts together. What were the building codes under public land use controls?
It just means that the city, state, municipality, I don't know how to say it.
Municipality, yeah.
That they have building codes, which is essentially just certain standards you have to build a home up to in order to be considered safe.
There you go. There you go. Building codes are those minimum construction standards for safety. Not to be confused with zoning. Those are apples and oranges, but they are both public land use controls. Now, here's the reason why I'm bringing those up, so we can create these layers. Because things have to meet certain safety criteria within your local municipality, if you were to build an addition onto your house or finish an unfinished room, we talked a little bit about this earlier on in the class, because I think Jacob said that he assisted your dad or somebody, right, in finishing an attic, or?
No. At most, my dad assisted me.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood, Jacob. Deep apologies, my friend. Deep apologies. Yeah, there you go. So if you finish the room out, we talked about, getting a permit. If you're finishing out this space, technically for certain modifications, and there's laws that are outside of the scope of this class as to when you need to pull a permit. Let me tell you why I'm bringing this up. If you were to add an addition and you didn't pull a permit, meaning the city did not come out and sign off on it and say that yes, it meets building codes and you did things the right way, that is what we call unpermitted space. Unpermitted space is a material fact. Here's the tie-in. In North Carolina, we do consider it okay to market the unpermitted space as square footage so long as it meets those 3 criteria and so long as you disclose that it is unpermitted space. In other words, if you were to measure a house and the total square footage was 3,000 and 700 of that was an attic that had been finished without a permit, you would say that it is a 3,000 square foot house, but then you would have to disclose that 700 of that square feet are unpermitted. Does that make sense for everybody? I was looking at y'all and I just kept trying to write with my pen. Did not work out. That does not say unpermitted. That says some, I don't know what that says.
I thought that it was illegal to finish a space without permits.
The thing is, your house is your house, and technically it is not in compliance, but it's not illegal in the sense that you're going to go to jail. It's not illegal in the sense that you can't sell your house. It's just a material fact that has to be disclosed to future consumers. And that's the same thing too. Just because a house got a CO at the time of its construction doesn't mean that it forevermore will meet the code, because people can go in and change things because they do it anyway. So, it's not... It is technically not lawful, but illegal is a strong word. Nobody's arresting you for not getting a permit in your house.
Yeah, figured.
Yeah. So, we talked about a lot of other different components of what you would do in these pre-listing meetings. Let me just remind you about the termination of listings. We've already talked about this. Better yet, you remind me, before I even switch slides, you remind me, what are the ways that your listing can terminate? Specifically a listing.
One of the parties can die,
Death of a party.
or breach of contract,
Breach of contract.
Mutual agreement
expiration,
Mutual agreement. Expiration date. Absolutely.
and contract being
Fulfillment of purpose. Absolutely.
Fulfillment of
Destruction of property.
Destruction of property, absolutely. Remember, destruction of property very much comes into play on the property-specific agency contracts, which a listing agreement is. Okay? Completion or fulfillment of purpose, expiration of the terms. Remember, we are not allowed to have an automatic renewal. It has to have a definite expiration date in our written contracts. Mutual agreement. Breached by one of the parties, operation of law, the government takes it by way of eminent domain. A bankruptcy hearing prevents them from selling it. Foreclosure prevents them from selling it. These things could end it. And then death or incapacity of either party. Now remember, an individual licensee dying will not kill the listing agreement if it's with a firm, because the firm is alive and well. But as I told y'all and I've reiterated, yes, in theory, a firm could die. It just wouldn't die in the same way that a person would. If the firm went under, if the firm closed its doors, whatever. And then also understand that if it was an agency contract, because I can almost guarantee you'll get these questions, an agency contract between the seller and an individual sole proprietor, if that sole proprietor dies, it is dead. Do not ever get caught up on test questions that say something like, oh, the real estate commission will reassign it to another brokerage firm. No, they won't. They don't care to that extent. It's just dead. Okay? If you ever see anything that suggests that the real estate commission is going to actually finish a transaction or, move it from one firm to another or, anything like that, no. Folks, let me help you out. The commission exists for one purpose and one purpose only. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but it exists to protect the general public. Who do you think they're really protecting the general public from? There you go. All of you aspiring real estate brokers, they are never looking after us. Their laws and rules exist to keep us in line, to make sure we know what to do to protect the public in real estate dealings. That's the sole reason. So if you ever see something like, oh, they'll reassign it, they'll get it completed, they'll make sure that the agent gets paid, none of the above. They ain't going to do none of that. They're an enforcement agency. They're an oversight agency. That's what they are. So here's the clarification, as I gave it to you a couple of times already. Destruction of the property does not kill every single contract, but it does kill property-specific ones, like listing agreements, like property management agreements, and like leases. Now, I skipped over sales contracts, so I'm going to tell you why. This is a very specific national versus state concept I'm about to teach you, okay? There is sales contracts utilized in every state. Obviously, there are, because every state sells property. And in general, if we had a sales contract for buyer A to purchase seller B's property, if the property was to burn down, that would be what we call impossibility of performance. You can no longer fulfill the obligations, and so under generalizations here, yes, that would kill a sales contract. So if you're on the national side, and you get a question in regard to a sales contract and destruction of the property, and would that terminate it? The answer is 1,000% yes. Here's the reason why I'm giving special emphasis to this. Later tonight, we will get into probably the North Carolina sales contracts, and there is a specific one that we utilize a lot that is testable, called the Offer to Purchase and Contract Standard Form 2T. And on that sales contract specifically, the contract does not automatically die with destruction of the property. The buyer has the right to move forward and be entitled to any insurance monies. See the difference there? Sales contracts in general, say what?
Say that one more time.
Yeah. Sales contracts in general would die with destruction of the property. However, if we were talking about the very specific sales contract, a specific one utilized in North Carolina called the Offer to Purchase and Contract Standard Form 2T, destruction of the property does not automatically kill that sales contract. There is a provision written into it that allows the buyer to decide to move forward in purchasing the destroyed or damaged property and being entitled to the insurance money as well. So this is where I told you, I'm going to circle back around to earlier on. I told you, you've got to understand that when we talk about agency in general, not every agency relationship is a real estate relationship. When we talk about contracts, are we talking about contracts in general? Are we talking about real estate contracts in general? Or are we talking about a very, very specific contract like the 2T? And you've got to pay attention on the test question because it changes depending on what we ask you. Does that make sense? Now, please understand that was not me teaching you the contracts yet. That was just a word of caution, that little, thing that I need to plant in your head so when I talk about it in depth later, you're like, oh, I vaguely remember this. I already told you this, buyer agency not terminated with destruction of the property because it's typically generalized. And so if you're under contract to buy a house and that one burns down, on to the next. We're still going to help you buy a house, so it's not going to be that one anymore. Here's just that quick little recap of when we looked at the residential square footage guidelines in North Carolina. Permanent heat source, baseboard, solar, radiant, mini splits would be fine. Forced air heat pumps. Can't use fireplaces. Can't use portable heaters. AC is not required. Finished, like finishes to the rest of the house. Minimum height of 7 feet from ground to ceiling, except in places where there's ductwork that has to be 6 feet 4 inches. And then in rooms with sloped ceilings, you can count the entire room up to the point, so long as the height is at least 7 feet in at least half the room, you can count it up to the point where the slopes are at least 5 feet from the floor to the slopes. And then accessible from other heated square footage. If you have to go outside to walk into a pool house, it cannot be included in the total number. If you have to walk out your front door and go up a set of stairs on the side of your house to go up to the second floor, cannot be included in the total number. If you have to leave the heated square footage to get to other heated square footage, it cannot be included in the total number. It would be called other area. What you got, Sam?
Well, you might have just answered it, but I guess you said pool, whatever. Like, so a pool house would be other area.
Other area. Yeah.
Or like an in-law suite that's detached.
That's exactly right.
Of course.
Yeah, it gives value. Folks, don't ever think that it doesn't give value. It sure does, but we just can't include it in the total number. So let's say that, the main house was, 2,500 and the pool house was 600. We cannot call it a 3,100 square foot house. It would be a 2,500 square foot house with a 600 square foot finished other area. It just has to be separated out.
Could you have a listing that's 2 individual homes on one piece of property?
No, you can't do that because of the way that the parcels are. And then, of course, zoning comes into play too, Jacob. Whether you realize it or not, a lot of zoning does not allow multifamily on one lot. There are restrictions in those ordinances where, you have to have one house per lot unless it's a auxiliary building, a shed, or something like that. So you couldn't sell it that way because then you're basically, it's very muddy. We'll say it that way.
Do you think that changed given the slow emergence of container homes and how some people are trying to rent those out?
No. In fact, I would wager that it's probably gotten more aggressive. Things like Airbnbs and container homes have caused a lot of problems for a lot of municipalities. And so those municipalities are cracking down on them and saying even more, you can't do this. It would be constituted as unlawful. Now, are there areas where you can get special zoning, special pockets to get it approved? Sure, you could, but that would be a process. Most don't allow these auxiliary buildings or secondary dwellings or anything like that. Yeah. What you got, Sam?
So, like in North Carolina, kind of out in the boonies, a lot of people have like family land where they build a house and then, I had kids, so I built another house on my land, and then, grandma lives over there, da 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 da.
Family compound.
Would all of those individual houses have to be parceled into a new lot. If, like, say the head of the land dies and nobody wants any of these houses anymore, they'd have to, like, rezone every individual house lot.
Potentially. It really comes down to the individual municipality. So if they say that you can have secondary buildings as long as, it's all one owner and as long as they're not leased out. And so if, let's say that you had land and you built 6 houses on there and you just let your kids live in it and it's all in your name, it may be legal within the ordinances. If you ever wanted to actually let them legally own it, meaning, transfer it to them, you might have to survey it out and create its own parcel and record it and then deed it that way. It would really be dependent on the municipality's rules. Yeah. Good questions. So the other square footage thing, folks, we're not going to spend too much time on square footage because it's not crazy testable, and we already basically covered the mathematics with it. Don't overthink things. If you had a ranch style home and we had all these measurements, and maybe it was 38 feet and 20 feet and 10 feet and 15 feet. It's very hard to do this geometric shape, but just like with the land, it's the same thing. You just cut it into pieces here, and then it's just length times width. If you figured out, that this, I don't know, let's just say this was 30. This would be a 30 by 38 rectangle. This would be a 10 by 15 rectangle. The calculations are the exact same as the math that we did for lots. It's just that houses we typically talk about as square feet, and then land we typically talk about in acres. But that's really all it comes down to. Now, the other things that you have to know potentially is that these are all based off of exterior measurements. If you're measuring a house, you're actually going outside. So in my picture right here, if this was a ranch, I would be standing outside along the vinyl siding, the brick siding, whatever it may be, and I would take a tape measure and I'd go from here to get that measurement. And then I'd measure from here to get that one, here to here. You are actually basing this off of external measurements. So always answer it that way. Square footage in North Carolina is based on measuring the outside of the house. Now there's a note right here that says, if you measure from the interior, you would need to add 6 inches. Well, yeah, if the square footage is based off of exterior measurements, if, let's say, you had a house that was basically a ranch, but it had one bonus room upstairs, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to climb on the top of your ladder to measure the outside of that one room. So what it's saying is it might be easier to measure from the inside. But if you do that, you would need to add 6 inches to any wall that is an exterior wall to account for the fact that it should have been measured from the outside. But that being said, always answer the question as based on exterior measurements.
That's interesting. Because I always thought and was told that it's the interior. So,
Nope.
Good to know.
Yep. All based on exterior measurements.
Do we have to measure the square footage of the home every time? For example, this house has already been sold once. We saw it on the MLS. Are we still responsible to then essentially remeasure it for the new listing?
Yeah. Has to be measured every single time. Why? Because number one, people can get things wrong. Number two, people can do additions, whether they be permitted or not. So you can't just rely on old ones, because who's saying that they didn't finish an attic? Who's saying that they didn't, build an addition? Who's saying that the other person didn't just guess? So the requirement to North Carolina is that we have to have it measured, whether it be by ourselves or somebody with greater expertise than us. It has to be measured as part of the current transaction. Even if you have personally measured that house 6 times over the past 20 years and you got it as a listing again, measure it again. Yep. So air conditioning, not necessary. Remember, it's not a material fact in and of itself. However, a discrepancy or incorrect information would be a material fact. If you knew that, it was being advertised incorrectly, you'd have to disclose that. But it's not a material fact in and of itself. Has to be accessible from other heated square footage. This is basically just fluff information. I don't think they're going to test you on this. What this means is if you were to ever measure the house and you are off, but you're within a 5% margin of the actual number, they're I'm not going to say you're absolved, but they're just going to give you a slap on the wrist. They say, well, be careful, because, you know, they know that there are some differentiations between the ways that some people measure. Now, if you're off by 10%, 15%, you're probably going to have a big old license reprimand, for sure. But they have this 5% little cushion, if you will, where they're not going to throw the book at you. Now, the other terms we talked about to end the night last night were these two right here, okay? Above grade, which is anything above the dirt. If you've got a crawl space and all the dirt is around your little bricks on the bottom and you don't have anything adjacent to dirt, then you are all above grade. If you got a basement, if you got a weird slope, if you got anything like that, you may have finished area down in your basement, and it can be considered finished and heated living area so long as it meets those three criteria, but it would have to be considered below grade. Any living space, or any space for that matter, that is adjacent to dirt on any portion of the wall. Doesn't have to be fully encased by dirt. If there's so much as a little bit of dirt on the other side of one wall, we have to call that below grade space. So let me give you a scenario to make sure you're with me here. True or false, you added a through-the-wall heating unit to the room over your detached garage that permanently heats and cools the living space, so it can now be added to the total heated square footage of your home when you decide to sell it.
False.
False, detached.
There you go. It's false. The keyword is detached. So that means you are leaving your house to go into this garage. So even though it meets all the other criteria, it does not meet the, accessible from other heated living area criteria. Last couple of mentions before we move on into bigger and better things. And of course, these are just mentions because they have a better and bigger place in later sections. When you're dealing with clients, whether they be buyer's agents or seller's agents, we are expected as real estate professionals to do what's called a comparative market analysis. The CMA, as it's called, or comparable market analysis, is us utilizing our expertise to help them determine a probable sales price. We do that using a certain methodology, and we will talk about that in the valuations section. Now, understand that you may have heard the term appraisals before, and you may not have heard this term before. An appraiser is a licensed person, just like we are, that is allowed to do appraisals. We are not appraisers. So what we do is called a CMA. An appraiser is the only person who can do an appraisal. Ours can never be used for a lender. So let me just make one more note here. If you go to buy a house, the bank that's lending you the money will want an appraisal ordered. So they send it off to a third-party appraiser who is unbiased to tell them what the value of a home is. An appraisal gives the value of the property, what the appraiser thinks it's worth at that given time. And that's what they use to determine whether or not they're going to lend you based on what we call loan-to-value ratios. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. We will never be able to use a CMA, also called a BPO, broker price opinion, for an appraisal or in place of an appraisal for lending situations, anything like that. It's just us using some data to help determine a probable sales price or a probable list price. What you got, Jacob?
Who typically pays for the appraisal?
The buyer. However, some lenders will reimburse the buyer. It depends on their policies. So they'll make the buyer pay for it up front, and then they will turn around and they'll give them a credit at closing to reimburse them as long as they use them as their lender. But it's the buyer who typically pays it because they're the ones getting the loan. Now, that's for the loan itself. There is nothing stopping anybody who owns a home right now. You could pick up the phone, call an appraiser today and say, come out and tell me what my home is worth. And in fact, if you do a cash out refi or pull equity out of your home, they will typically do an appraisal as well. And so in that case, it would be the seller. But in a typical sales transaction, the buyer pays for the appraisal.
They would do it for reverse mortgage as well, right?
Yeah, anything like that.
But those are frowned upon.
Yeah, not a good idea. I mean, there's a reason why you might want to do it, but there's also very, very big be cautious things. Like if you've got people who you intended to leave that house to, better not do it. But if you plan on dying and you ain't got nobody, do it to it, prove it, live your best life.
Could you explain to me how a reverse mortgage works? Because we actually sold a house to somebody who was doing a reverse mortgage just like a couple weeks ago, and I don't really know what it means.
They're doing a reverse mortgage in order, they're selling a house that they have a reverse mortgage on, or the house that y'all just sold the person to, or the house that you just sold to the person they're doing a reverse mortgage on.
Both.
Probably not going to be. There's probably a misunderstanding there, and of course we'll get into this in the finance section. But folks, how does a typical mortgage work? Remember, that's technically a misnomer, but how does a typical mortgage work? What happens?
You pay the bank for the loan.
There you go.
Plus interest.
Yeah, there you go. You borrow money from the bank. They give you money. And then you pay it back over time plus interest. So you make monthly mortgage payments. A reverse mortgage is the opposite of that. The bank pays you monthly money. So a lot of older persons will use equity in their home and do what's called a reverse mortgage. And so they will basically get living expenses paid to them. So as opposed to paying the bank $2,000 or $3,000 a month, the bank is going to pay you $2,000 or $3,000 a month. And the reason they do that is because you have so much equity in your home. They're basically just lending you out in small portions on that, have a lien on your property just like a standard mortgage would, and then they will ultimately, when you die, take ownership of your house, sell it, and get their money. So it's not something that you would typically be able to do with a new construction unless they bought it cash and then turned around and filed a reverse mortgage on it. That would be kind of an option.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not even finished built yet, but she's under contract, and her current home she has a reverse mortgage on, but she still has a crap ton of equity, and she's putting like $200,000 down on this house.
Yeah.
I don't understand her reasons.
And I couldn't even begin to fathom. Yeah. I mean, without seeing it, I couldn't. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't understand her reasoning. I don't really care to. I mean.
Yeah, the problem with them is, it's great for somebody who's got a lot of equity or a paid off house who just needs expenses to live, right? If you're on your last leg and you don't care about the house, it'll give you living expenses. It's basically like a great way to collect on, something like a retirement fund. But I had a student in my class one time where, he was on a deed to the house with his father, and his father did that. I said, well, Slick, you're about to lose that house, because what's going to happen is however much money he's borrowed against it, you're going to have to pay that off to keep the house when your dad dies. So as opposed to just inheriting that house or being part owner, you're going to have to pay off the $150,000 plus interest they lent him in that reverse mortgage. So it's got its own things with it.
Was there like a because I had a similar situation, so I'm just trying to know, was there a specific time period that he needed to pay back the loan?
It would be negotiated from the offset, so it depends on how much equity you have, how long you want to go through it. The thing is, though, with a reverse mortgage, most people aren't intending to pay it back. They're intending to die, and then the house would just be sold, and the banks would get their money at that point. So, as cheerful as that sounds. So it would all depend on what you negotiate with the bank.
Is it usually like? I guess with that statement, because that's kind of what the situation was. Is that kind of how it's suggested to people? Like, it's kind of like the last leg for you to kind of have supplemental income?
Yeah, I mean, and yet again, it depends on your estate, what you plan to leave behind, if you got kids. Because let's say, once again, Josh, if we got somebody who owns a house that's worth $600,000, their retirement is used up, their 401k is used up, their disability is used up, their pension's used up, they have no more money coming in except for maybe some Social Security, which is not enough to live on. And that house, they could do one of two things. They could sell that house, take the cash, live in a retirement community, and just spend that money until they die. Or they could stay in their house and just have the bank pay them living expenses, knowing that the bank will eventually get their money by putting a lien on that house to make sure that they get theirs when that house is sold and his estate or her estate is settled. So it's not uncommon. It would be very ill-advised for somebody your age, or my age to do this kind of thing. But if you're 90, what the hell, Unless that was a house that was sentimental, what does it matter?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Folks, let's go off on a tangent here, okay? Let's talk about some math. Now, here's where I told you I was going to teach you some tricks. I'm going to say a word that I've said before, and it's that word that you don't like, but I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to trick you into doing it in a moment, okay? So here's the word again, and it was algebra, okay? There is a lot of times where algebra can come into place in this class. Don't throw up in your mouths, okay? It's not that bad. But I'm going to show you an easier way to do that. Wake up, Corey. It's not that bad. You sleepy too, right? Me too. I know. Me too. Got a headache? Yeah. These lights that I have to keep me lit up. I'm with you. So here's what we're going to talk about, okay? This is what we get into calculating net to a seller. Well, folks, earlier on in this class, I started using some terminology and I started talking about closing disclosures, aka settlement statements. What were the words that I utilized when we were talking about settlement statements?
Is that the HUD?
HUD 1 is a type of settlement statement. That is true, but there were very specific words that I used. I said all monies that show up on the settlement statement are either a this or a that.
Debit or credit?
Debit or credit.
There you go. A debit or a credit. And what is a credit?
Credit is when you pay something, but the money. Hold on.
It means the opposing party owes.
When you take money from somebody.
So,
Yeah.
hold on. This, if you have any kind of accounting background, as weird as it is, this is the opposite of financial accounting. So, in the real estate world, a credit is we are giving you money. And a debit is we are taking money from you. So, the way that you think about it is your credit card and your debit card. If you swipe your credit card, somebody just gave you money. Yeah, you're going to have to pay it back later, but that's not the point right now. Somebody just gave you money. American Express, MasterCard, Discover. So the credit is giving you money. A debit is taking money away from you. Well, let me explain why this is important. I want you to just picture that we could divide everything into credits and debits. And so, of a seller. Now, let me make one other statement before I go down this route that I want to go. Understand that the other thing you have to realize is that there are certain things on the closing disclosure that affect the buyer only. There are certain things that affect the seller only. And there are certain things that affect both. If it only affects one party, it's called a single entry item. If it affects both parties, it's called a double entry item. Let me show you what I mean. And I'll just slap this over here. I'll just put buyer. We're not going to actually finish out the buyer because we're focusing on the seller right now. But underneath each, I'm going to put a line for, let me move this little box somewhere. Credits and debits, and then same thing, credits and debits. So let me show you how this works. If I said that the purchase price of a property was $400,000, well, does the purchase price affect the buyer, the seller, or both? Both. So let's start with the seller. What would be the purchase price to the seller? Is it a credit or a debit?
To credit.
Debit. Or the seller, yeah.
To the seller, it's going to be a debit.
It's a credit.
No, the
And to the
seller
buyer,
is
it's a debit.
Hold on, folks. Think about it. The seller is getting paid $400,000. They are selling their house for $400,000 and somebody is agreeing to pay them $400,000. It is a credit to the seller. $400,000 purchase price. So I'm just going to put, so you can follow along with me here, 400K PP purchase price. So we're going to put that here. I'm just going to put the 400K, but so that's the purchase price. It is a credit. Somebody is paying the seller $400,000. Now, what is it to the buyer?
To debit.
It is a debit because the buyer is agreeing to pay that amount of money. Everybody still tracking with me so far?
The only reason I understand this because I'm an accountant. It's the income statement.
It's an income statement.
Any expenses is debit, and any non-expenses, right, are credit. So that's the only thing that keeps me saying that.
There you go. There you go. So let's go down with a couple more things here. Now, I'm not going to throw anything into the mix that you don't understand yet. But let's say, now, let's see if you can follow with me here. Let's say the seller owes $200,000 to the bank to pay off their current loan. In other words, to release that lien. So we'll call it $200,000 loan payoff. I'm just going to put LP, loan payoff. To the seller, is that a credit or a debit?
Debit.
Debit, because they have to pay the bank that much money. So we're going to put $200,000 under the seller debits for loan payoff. Now, does that affect the buyer in any way, shape, and form?
No.
No. If I was to say that the seller was paying a 6% commission, would that be a credit or a debit?
Debit.
To the seller.
Debit to the seller. So if you were to take your calculator of the purchase price of $400,000, getting a 6% commission would be $24,000. That's going to be a debit to the seller. I'm just going to call this commissions. Now, I'm going to introduce another concept just to throw some more numbers in the mix, and then I'll kind of wrap up the point here and move on to the bigger lesson. What if we said that the buyer was getting a 80% loan to value ratio? Now, I'm not going to make you guess here. Folks, this is a very common way to articulate the money that a buyer is borrowing. So if I say 80% loan to value ratio, that means they are borrowing 80% of the purchase price or the appraised value, whichever is lower. I'll explain that note in the financing chapter. But that means that of the $400,000 purchase price, they are borrowing 80% of that. So they're getting a loan amount of $320,000. So first, let's answer this. If the buyer's getting a loan for $320,000, does that affect the buyer, the seller, or both?
The buyer.
Just the buyer.
Only the buyer. The seller does not care where the money comes from as long as they get their $400,000. So this is something between the buyer and the bank. And so now that we know it's only going to affect the buyer, is it a debit or a credit to the buyer?
So would that be a credit because it's coming to him from the bank?
That's exactly right. Folks, yes, you are going to have to pay it back later, but not today on the day of closing. So it is a credit to the buyer. I'm just going to call this loan amount. Okay, loan amount. Now, let me wrap up the point here. Folks, this is a very condensed version with only very minuscule components. But this is all a settlement statement is. A list of all the credits and the debits for the buyer and the seller. And so watch what happens. If we wanted to know what the seller was going to walk away with, well, they are going to be paid $400,000. All you have to do, we know that's the total credits based on the scenario I gave you. And then, of course, the debits, $200,000 plus $24,000 would be $224,000 for their total debits. If you take the difference between your credits of $400,000 minus your debits that you have to pay of $224,000, this is what we call the net to seller. what are they going to walk away with at closing? In this very simplistic example, they're walking away with $176,000. So when I say net to seller, it is just the difference between their total credits, their total debits. Does that make sense? Now, please don't think of this as profit. This is not profit. Profit is a correlation of what you paid versus what you made. We're not there yet, but this is what they're walking away with, what they will actually get a check for at closing. Called net to seller. Go ahead.
So for the most part, the net to seller is always going to be a positive number.
Well, unless it's a short sale. Obviously, they could owe money at closing, but that would be a very, very specific circumstance, right? Most of the time, they're walking away with money, as long as they made good investments and good choices. But yeah, most of the time, it's going to be a positive number, but it would be, possible that it could be they owe money at closing. Now, I haven't included anything else into the mix, but for the buyer side of things, folks, buyers work the exact same way, except instead of calling it net to seller, right, for the buyer, it's called cash to close. So if the bank's giving you $320,000 and you promise to pay $400,000, well, you still owe $80,000. That's your closing cost. So when I said 80% loan to value ratio, that meant that you were putting a 20% down payment. That's the 80 grand. So the difference between, in this scenario, the buyer's total debits and the buyer's total credits is the 80 grand down payment that they have to bring to closing. So for the buyer, it's called cash to close. For the seller, it's called net to seller. Now, are there way more variables and complexities than this? Yes. But this is a closing disclosure in a nutshell. That's all it is. Kingsley, are you trying to talk? It looked like you were trying to talk, but you're not. I didn't hear anything.
No, I'm eating.
Oh, okay. You were unmuted. I just didn't know.
Seth,
Yeah.
do they still have investors that help with the down payments for low-income people so they don't have to come with anything to the table and it's paid out of closing? Do those programs still exist?
Grants by the government, yes. There are still some grants that exist for certain qualified buyers under certain criteria, and they're typically accompanied by some type of time frame agreement where as long as they stay in the house for 10 years, they can be forgiven or things like that. But if you try to sell it before then, yeah, there are still some programs like that that exist.
Okay, do they have the investors that do that still?
The thing is, you got to be very careful of what you say when you say investors. An investor intends to make money. So if an investor is doing it, that means they have a stake in the house, which means when you go to sell it, they're going to get a portion of your profits. There are plenty of companies who will be happy to give you money and take a share in your profits, but be very cautious of those people. Yeah.
Well, they existed a long time ago, so at closing they would get their money back in a certain percentage. But I didn't know if those programs still existed anymore.
Well, there's about 10 billion programs, good, bad, and ugly ones, so I wouldn't be able to say specifically which ones, but yeah, there's a lot. So now let's take this to the next level, okay? Sometimes, folks, sorry, did somebody just ask something? No. Sometimes, and especially in this class, you're going to need to calculate what we would need to sell for in order for a seller to walk away with a certain amount of money. Now, realistically, we're going to calculate what we think it could sell for. We're going to minus all their expenses that we think they're going to incur, and that's going to tell us their net. But of course, sometimes the seller will say, well, I need to net $200,000. I need to net $120,000. Okay? Well, before I even show you what's on the next slide, let me give you one more piece of insight to help you understand the math that we're about to do. If we were listing a home on behalf of a seller, and let's say that we were charging 6%, and let's just use that $400,000 number again. If we were to sell the house for $400,000, and let's say that there was no closing cost, there was no loan payoff, there was none of that stuff, is the seller going to walk away with $400,000? Why not?
Because
They have to pay commission.
There you go. They have to pay us. Ours comes off the TOP, folks. We get paid first. So I want you to understand what that means. In a perfect world, if they had no other expenses, can we all agree that the most they could walk away with is 94% of the purchase price? Does that make sense for you? Because we took 6 off the top. What would that leave? When you take 6% away from 100%, 94%. Let me tell you why that's so important. You could say, okay, well, $400,000 times our 6% commission to figure out what the commission was of $24,000. And then you could say, well, $400,000 minus $24,000 leaves the seller with $400,000 minus $24,000, $376,000. And of course, we got the net to the seller in that scenario. But the reason why I just showed you that, watch how much easier this is. If we want to know what the seller is going to walk away with, if they had no other expenses except for commission, here's the easy way. We're taking 6% off the top, which means they're left with 94%. You ready for this? 400,000 times 94%. Bam. It's so much easier. One fell swoop, there it is. There's a reason I'm showing you this. But is everybody okay with what I just said before I show you the next piece?
Yes.
So here's, and the slides sometimes don't do a good job of explaining things the way I want to, but I'm going to explain it the way I want you to know it. I want you to think of a scenario where we said, okay, they need to net a certain amount of money. Well, folks, this is where algebra comes into play. I'm just going to actually pull up my whiteboard here. I'm just gonna create this for you. I want you to see this because this is a very testable math. I guarantee it is. Where's my whiteboard? There it is. So let me give you the scenario on how I want you to learn this, how I want you to understand this. What we might ask you, what the test might ask you, is something along the lines of, no, I don't want any of those. A seller has a loan payoff of $125,000, and it's always going to be a word problem. We'll say loan payoff. They got closing cost of, $1,200. We'll put that as closing costs. And they want to net, walk away with $50,000. And so the question is, well, what do we need to sell for in order to net that amount of money? And do you see how complex this is? You're like, well, wait a second. How the hell am I supposed to know? Well, there's formulas you can do. So can we all agree that if I then went on to tell you that we were charging let's just change it. Let's say we were charging a 7% commission. Well, we know that 7% is coming off the top, and then we know what their other expenses are. So let me show you where algebra comes into play, and then I'm going to trick you into doing algebra, and I promise it will work every time. You ready for this? I don't know what the purchase price is, but that's what I need to know. But could we all agree that 100% of the purchase price minus 7% of the purchase price minus $125,000 loan payoff minus $1,200 in closing costs needs to equal what they want to walk away with, $50,000. Does that make sense to you? We don't know what the purchase price is, but 100% of it minus our commission minus the closing costs needs to leave them with $50,000. This is where algebra comes into play. Algebra is using these numbers to help you determine something you don't know. And so did you eat something gross, or are you shaking your head at algebra? At first I thought it was algebra, and then you had this face like you just ate like a black jelly bean. Like that's what you do. Like that was the face, because that's the face I would make if I had a black jelly. I'd be like, yeah. So you just ate something that you were not a fan.
I'm eating something sour.
Yeah. Okay.
I eat sugar.
Okay. No worries. I just saw that face. I'm like, was that algebra or was that something else? But then I saw kind of like the tongue movement. I'm like, no, that wasn't an algebra face. That was a something else face. So this is where you plug in this variable. And the whole premise with algebra, folks, is you get everything on one side except for that unknown variable. And then you can figure out the value of it. So watch what happens. Folks, follow along with me, and then I promise I'm going to make this so much easier for you. You ready? Anything you do to one side, you have to do to the other side. So if you add 1,200 on this side, you need to add 1,200 on this side. That negates itself. If you add $125,000 on this side, you need to add $125,000 on this side. That's gone. 100 minus 7 is 93p, where 93 is a percentage. Now watch, we've really condensed this down. Now what you're really looking at is that 93p equals 50,000 plus 1,200 plus 125,000, which is 176,000. Now we're not done yet, because we need p by itself. When you have this representative of a number beside the unknown variable, that's multiplication. Well, so what we're saying is 93% of p equals this, so you need to divide by 96% on this side. I'm sorry, 93. I don't know why I'm saying 96. Divide by 93 on that side, and divide by 93% on this side. Now, folks, it is a percentage. And so now the purchase price equals 176,200 divided by 0.93%. You would need to sell this home for 189,462 and some change. And if you don't believe me, work the problem backwards. You sold it for that much, but we took our 7% commission, multiply that by 0.93 to take it back to where it was. This is what they made after paying us our commission. They had to pay off their $125,000 loan payoff. They had to pay off their $1,200 in closing costs. They wanted to have $50,000 left over. They sure do. You see how you can use algebra to figure out the answer here. Now, some of you probably didn't like that.
No.
Let me show you something, folks. Don't let it hurt your feelings. Let me show you this. Let me find an example here. This is my stuff never work whenever I'm teaching. Like I could use it all day long, and then my files are like, nope, not opening now. I think it might just be, it's hidden behind my Zoom window. That's what it is. Here we go. I told you to bear with me, and then I was going to make it so much better. Okay, I'll make the boo-boos go away. You got all these brain boo-boos. You're like, Seth, I don't like this. Let me show you. Just got to give you a practice problem here. I'm going to get rid of this off the screen. I showed you why it worked. Now I'm going to teach you how to accidentally do algebra. Sounds good, doesn't it?
No, please teach me how to intentionally do algebra. I want to be able to get the right answer intentionally, on purpose.
I just taught you how to intentionally do it, Jacob. I'm sorry if you didn't get it. You know, I just intentionally taught you how to do algebra. But those of you who didn't like it, that means that it would be a little bit harder to teach you the intentional way. Let me show you the accidental way. I promise you're going to like this, okay? Let me find a good problem here. Almost there. Should be right after this section. Or 2 after this section. Here we go. So if you look right here. No, what's happening? No, I do not need that. Okay, look at this. Let me explain this to you. Let me zoom in a little bit. At what price must a property sell to give the seller a net of $60,000 after paying the broker a 6% commission, paying off a $480 lien, and paying closing costs of $850? You can all agree that this word problem is very similar to the math that I just gave you. It's just in a word problem. You agree? You ready for this? Folks, what is the commission? Like, don't give me the actual number of the commission. It's just 6%. That's all I'm looking for. 6%, right? So what percentage of 100 is left over after you take away 6%?
94.
94%. You ready for the instructions on how to accidentally do algebra the easiest way you'll ever in your life? I want you to look at this problem, and I want you to add up every single number you see that has nothing to do with commission. And once you've totaled all the numbers up, I want you to divide it by 94% and tell me what you get.
I like that better.
I told you would. Eliza, you feel good about that too? Doesn't that sound so much better? Add up every single number you see, folks. It's not commission. Do it for me. Put it in the chat. Now, I will tell you, there's always some people who still don't quite grasp how easy this concept is, and you may get it wrong in the first one, but if I give you another one, I promise you're going to be feeling good about it. Do it for me real quick, and I'll show you what I mean.
So I know with excise tax, we're supposed to round to the nearest whole dollar.
Up. Always round up to the nearest whole dollar. Don't just say round because that can be dangerous. But yeah.
All of the other math, you said that you want us to round to the nearest, cent, correct?
Yeah, I typically do, but the test will typically tell you when it's a math problem. Like, for instance, remember I told you this worksheet is all based on 3 decimals. To get the answer correctly, you're supposed to do it to 3 decimals. The test will tell you to, round to the nearest, cent or penny or dollar. The test will tell you what to do. Seeing a lot of consistency in the answers over there. Consistency is a good thing for math problems. Give you just another second. I'll show you. So I said, add up every single number you see in this problem except for commission. And when you total them all up, divide by the percentage that's left over of 100% after you take your commission. So if you followed my instructions, it should have looked something like this. Let me shrink my calculator down. $60,000 plus $480 plus $850, total it all up, divided by 0.94 or 94%. $65,244, which is what you were all putting in the chat. Folks, let me show you why that works. 100% of an unknown purchase price minus 6% of an unknown purchase price minus a $480 lien minus closing cost of $850 needs to equal the $60,000. So when you add 850 to this side, you add 850 to this side. When you add 480 to this side, you add 480 to this side. And so I tricked you into doing algebra because when you add up every single number you see that's not commission, you have already shifted everything to that one side, and then all that's left to do is divide by the percentage that's left over, 94%, to leave you with your purchase price. I just tricked you into doing algebra. And it was so much sweeter than actually doing it, wasn't it? I promise the net to seller math is testable. And I promise if you remember this, you will ace it. It works every time. If the question is how much do we need to sell for in order for them to net a certain amount, follow that mantra I just gave you. It will always work. And this is math we revisit in post-licensing. So I'm here to make your lives easier. I can teach math just as many ways as you need me to. Probably not as many as Stephanie, but I can teach it enough ways for it to be comfortable, all right? I ain't scared of math. I can teach it. Make sure y'all are comfortable with it. Now, I'll give you another example, another attempt to do this, just to solidify in your head that it works after you take a break, but I owe you a break. So come back at 7:30.
We are recording this class, right?
We absolutely are, Tim. The entire thing from the word go is recorded, my friend.
You got it.
Yep. Y'all enjoy your break. I'll see you at 7:30. So we are talking about the math that goes with the net to seller. And of course it is, as I said, a testable form of math. And overall, as much as it's, algebra and it's not necessarily a fun thing, it is actually a pretty straightforward math once you kind of get comfortable with this trick that I've kind of taught you. And so I gave you one. Let's give you another one. This one right here in front of us, it's got multiple choice. Do the same thing, folks. Find every single number that has nothing to do with commission, add them together, once you total them out, divide by what is left over after you take the commission from 100%. See what you get. So, looking pretty unanimous. Let's quickly work through it. We've got $90,000, which they wish to net. And they've got closing cost of $500. Doesn't look like there's any other expenses, so when you total those out, you get $90,500, and then we are charging 6% commission, which leaves them with 94%, so divided by 0.94 or 94% gives us 96,276. Isn't that lovely? Yeah, y'all like that, man. I can do that, so we're good on that one. We'll take that. And of course, let me throw one into the mix, because if you work through the math packet to get extra practice, this one's always going to come into the mix. So I want to point out something here, and I'll let you practice this one as the last one, and then we'll move on into other things. Okay. Miss Raines wants to net up $17,500 from the sale of her property. A prospective buyer wants Miss Raines to pay 2% service fee on a $15,000 loan. If she must pay a 6% brokerage fee and the 2% service fee, what is the minimum selling price? Now, folks, students get confused on this one. Let me explain why. You see that percent, and it makes your brain go bleh because of this commission. That 2% is 2% of $15,000. And that would basically just be a closing cost. So calculate the 2% of $15,000 and call it a closing cost, and then do it the exact same way and tell me what you come up with. Give it just another second. So, let me show you here. Let's just first calculate that service fee. We've got $15,000 loan times 2%. Should be a service fee of $300. And then we've got the same kind of methodology here. She wants to net $17,500. She's got this closing cost of $300. And then she is paying a 6% brokerage fee, which means she's going to be left with 94%. So divided by 0.94 should be 18,936, or B. Everybody feeling good?
No, my math never adds up. I did it exactly that way, and I got 18,917.
Did you round in the midst of it somewhere?
I don't know. No.
I would just like punch into your calculator right now and do 17,800 divided by 0.94.
So this is what I've got. I've got 15,000 times 2%. I got 17,500.
Hold on, no, don't. You can't plug it in all in one fell swoop because order of operations can change things. So you want to make sure that you kind of work it out yourself, because your calculator is going to use, PEMDAS, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division. It's going to use all those. So I don't like put it in as one long equation. Just take your 17,500 plus your 300 and then hit enter for 17,800. Okay. Now divide by 0.94.
So we're not adding in, we're not trying to even calculate the service fees in this equation. We're just taking the commission and the 17,500.
Hold that thought, Josh. Did it work, Misty?
No, I got 1,893,000.
No, hold on. No. One more time. 17,800. Punch that in your calculator.
Okay, all right.
Divided by.
Calculator is completely clear.
Yeah, make sure your calculator is completely clear. So 17,800 divided by 0.94 equals.
Oh, okay. I'm hitting 0.94 and percent.
No, there you go. You can't do that. 0.94 is already converting the percentage. So you either hit 94 and then hit percent, or you do 0.94 in your head. Can't do both because that's a very, very different number.
So it's like my stuff never works.
Yeah.
I've never mapped.
It's one or the other. Percent button, 94 in the percent button, or 0.94 because you've already converted it into a decimal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now let's go back to your question, Josh. We absolutely did do something with the service fee. The service fee was $300. It was 2% of the $15,000 loan, which we just called a closing cost. So $15,000 loan times 2%, that's the service fee. So we just called that a closing cost. So $300 closing cost plus she wants to net $17,500, which is where we got this number. That's all the numbers combined, divided by everything that's left over after we take our commission from 100%, 0.94. So divided by 0.94 or 94% was B. So we did use this. There you go. We did use the service fee.
Do buyers often ask sellers to help with their loans?
With closing costs, yeah, they can. I mean, there was nobody giving closing costs over the past couple of years when it was like a crazy seller's market. They've made a big resurgence. Sellers are paying closing costs right now. Not uncommon in any way, shape, and form. So, let's keep on keeping on. I need to get into some different things tonight. We've already talked about buyers. I told you buyer agency agreement, listing agreement. You know, they're both agency agreements. Of course, there's some differentiation on how they can die. Of course, we have a oral buyer agency agreement in North Carolina. That is the only agreement that can be oral. Remember, what are the two things about oral buyer agency agreements you have to know? I guess technically three things. Let's make it three things.
They're not open-ended.
Open-ended, which means there's no termination date. You can cancel any time.
Non-exclusive.
Non-exclusive, you cannot bind them to work with only you under an oral buyer agency agreement. What's the other thing that I kept saying they had to be?
Express.
Express. They have to be stated. It's not enough to just say, all right, get in the car. That'd be an implied agreement. We don't do those in North Carolina. Implied agreements in NC are unlawful. So we would have to still state, hey, I'm going to be your buyer's agent. It's going to be in an oral capacity. It is non-exclusive and open-ended. If you want to see a house listed by my firm, I would need oral consent to dual agency. That consent would have to be reduced to a written consent. At the time that we reduced it to a written buyer agency agreement, it would have to be reduced to a written buyer agency agreement at the time that you wanted to put an offer in on a property. That's what I mean by express. We would still kind of talk them through all that. And then here's the most important piece of an express oral buyer agency agreement. You ready for this? After you go over all this stuff with them, you look them in the eyes and you go, and if you don't do that, it's not official. Commission's rules, not mine.
Can you do that again?
What is that hand thing? What does that mean?
Listen, like that, boom, and then you explode, right? Giving somebody a fist bump. Got to make it official.
Fist bump, sure.
Is that like a handshake is official type thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
You ain't never walked up and been like fist bump with your homies? And then sometimes you put a little pizzazz and you do the explosion and you go.
You might as well just put everything in writing.
No. Fist bumps and explosions, Tim. Fist bumps and explosions. That's right. Also be aware that we looked at the exclusive buyer agency agreement in writing, but I told you there is a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement in writing as well. Of course, we've already talked about the provisions. I'm not going to spend too much time here. The general type of the property sought, their obligations, our obligations, how we intend to get paid. Are they authorizing dual agency? Are they not? The steps we're working with the buyer, I'm just going to breeze through this because we need to kind of move on. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to talk about the math that goes to the buyers yet. Why? Because that'll make more sense when we get into the financing section. And I'm going to be honest with you, the qualifying math is the sucky math. That is the hardest math throughout here. It's not hard in general, Stephanie, but it's the hardest math in this entire curriculum when we get into amortization schedules and using those in conjunction with qualifying somebody to try to figure out what their payments are. Can they afford it? People struggle with that to the umpteenth degree. Folks, I'm going to be honest with you. When we get to that math, I'm going to look at you and I'm going to explain it once, and I'm going to say, if you don't get it, take the L, because it's not worth hurting your brains over it for one question on the test. I mean, it's just really not, if I'm being completely honest. But we'll get there. Now, I also want to make a statement. Yes, part of our job is to help qualify a buyer, meaning we need to make sure that they can actually buy a house. In reality, we're not qualifying a buyer. We have lender friends who are qualifying the buyers. We need to have a general understanding of what debt to income ratios are, why credit scores are important, the assets or the cash liquidity they have available for due diligence fees and earnest monies and things like that. But of course, the other part of our job is buyer's agents. Help them identify properties that may be suitable for them, take them to go see said properties, negotiate the best price, help them discover material facts, advise them to get home inspections, look through documents like restrictive covenants, help them identify if their ultimate use can be met. Can they, do what they need to do? Are they allowed to have chickens if the chickens are important to them? Can they operate a home business if that's important to them? Whatever that may be. Oh, Manoj, I'm tripping out over here. Is your phone still in here? Can I remove that second device? Your second device is still in. Do you need that one?
Yeah, my computer audio is not working, so I'm using phone audio.
Okay. All right, you're fine. I just didn't know. I'm like sitting there. I'm like, where is Manoj at? He didn't put BRB in chat, and I'm looking at the letter, and then I'm like, wait a second. That's right. Manoj had the second device, so then I see you sitting over there. So, all right, if you need it, it's cool. We already talked about the CMA. Folks, understand that you would do a CMA for a seller and a buyer. For a seller, it's to determine what we should probably sell it for, what we could sell it for. For a buyer, it's to make sure that they are asking a reasonable price for it. Remember what I told you under the common law of agency. We owe them obedience, meaning following their lawful, willful instructions. It is not illegal to overprice a house. So should you automatically be paying what the seller is asking as a buyer? No. Sometimes it's overpriced, and we can get a way better deal than that. So after we do a CMA and help them determine that, we're going to negotiate, help them prepare that offer, and then, of course, go through the whole what we call contract to close kind of flow. And these are all just kind of like general understandings of the flow of a brokerage deal. Not crazy stuff. And I'm going to go fast through these next couple slides because I've already said it like 10 million times, okay? I really have. Oral buyer agency agreements, non-exclusive, open-ended, okay? Has to be expressed. We clearly state the terms. Can never have them bound to you in this. Would have to be reduced to writing no later than presentation of an offer. We need at least oral consent to dual agency to do that if you are acting as an oral buyer. But understand, because the listing agreements have to be in writing from the offset, you would need written consent from all sellers to do dual agency, even before you take an oral buyer agent. So let me ask you a question here. True or false, buyer's agent is required to perform a comparative market analysis for their client prior to their client making an offer?
False.
Oh,
Oh, I guess it's true then.
True.
It's true. How are we going to take care of them? Remember those fiduciary duties. If we are not looking after them and we say, yeah, it's a house, offer some money. Why are we getting paid if that's all we do? I don't know. Just offer some money, see what happens. Let's just throw something at it and see if it sticks. Yeah, definitely something that we have an obligation to do in looking after them, right? That whole exclusive and fiduciary and agency capacity, we are looking after their best interest. Now, this next piece I'm going to breeze over as well because we have talked about this. Folks, I told you on day one, when you are differentiating some terminologies between, broker and agent and realtor, and then of course in other states, salesperson versus broker. But there's another thing that comes into play is for work reasons, most real estate brokers are affiliated with a firm as what we call an independent contractor. They utilize a 1099, and so that is non-employee compensation. So they are not treated as employees. They are not employees. They do not pay employment taxes on behalf of you. So you get your total gross commission. And then you are basically self-employed, and you have to pay your own taxes from the money you make as a real estate broker. So even though you are an independent contractor, even though you are self-employed, you do have a relationship with your firm, and as such have to follow their policies and procedures as long as they are in line with the law and everything therein. So the other side of that would be somebody who is in fact an employee. If you work for the man, right, and you get a paycheck for the hours or salary that you are putting in, and they are withholding Social Security taxes and 401ks and, insurance and all these things, that is an employee. Very different things. Most people from a real estate point of view are independent contractors. I'm not saying employees don't exist in real estate. There are lots of employees in offices, but you in general brokerage and in sales, you're not an employee, you're an independent contractor. So just understanding those differentiations between the two. So let me throw another question into the mix here. In all of this fun-filled material that we've been talking about for agency as we kind of wrap this up. I'm kind of talking and pausing because I know some of y'all who are note takers are probably hating my guts right now. But the thing is, I've already said a lot of these things a lot of times, and you have access to these slides, and you need to hear me teach you these concepts that we got to get to. You do not want to teach them yourselves. The last thing we want to do is run out of time where we say, no, I'm not going to teach you the last 7 chapters. You're on your own. You would rather me rush through these and teach it all to you versus you just missing out on some of it, I promise. Because if I get through it all, then we can circle back around and talk about the things that are really causing you some indigestion. So here's a question for you, okay? North Carolina seller is aware of a significant defect within their property. Regarding this defect, the seller may answer no representation on the RPODS form. True or false?
True.
True. Remember, in North Carolina, we have the doctrine of caveat emptor, which means let the buyer beware. That means the seller has basically zero obligation of disclosure from themselves to the buyer. So they're not allowed to lie, they're not allowed to commit fraud, but they are allowed to say, I plead the fifth, which is what no representation is doing. So they could either say, yes, there's an issue, let me tell you about it, or I'm not telling you, you figure it out. If they were to say no, that would be fraud. That'd be a problem. And understand the burden is on real estate brokers to discover and disclose these things. We would always have to sing like a bird. Sellers don't. Now, one other note here is, remember, on the MOG, the seller cannot answer no representation in regard to themselves on whether they intend to or have severed the mineral oil and gas rights. And on the lead-based paint disclosure, there's no option for no representation. But those are the only two where there's no option for no representation for them. How about this question? True or false? In North Carolina, an oral buyer agency agreement must include agreement on compensation and whether or not dual agency will be practiced. There you go, Eliza. I like it.
I would say true.
That's true.
False, because it's just an oral agreement, right?
But it has to be what, Kirsten? Express. You gotta state it. They gotta know what they're getting into. It's not just get in the car, let's go see some pretty houses. That'd be implied. So we would have to talk about, well, hey, if we get you under contract, if you want to put in an offer, we'd have to reduce it to writing. If you want to see a house listed by my firm, that'd be dual agency. You'd have to authorize it. If I get you under contract after we go into a written one, I expect to make money. You'd have to tell them some of the facts about it so they know what they're agreeing to. That's that word express. Woo! Woo! Me too, Stephanie. Me too. So here is just some vocabulary for some of the things we've talked about. Price fixing, prohibited under what?
Antitrust laws.
Antitrust laws, which is also one of the things on here. There you go. Yeah, what's an extender clause?
That's the protection, right?
Yeah, extender clause, also called a protection period, also called a
Tail something, tail.
tail clause, tail something. Cat tail, dog tail, getting some tail, tail in, tail hawk, tail something. Yeah, tail something it is. It's called a tail clause, extender clause, protection agreement. What's a net listing?
The amount that a seller's expecting to make.
That is a seller net. What is a net listing?
Oh, shit.
A net listing is where you keep anything over the listed price.
That's exactly right. Seller needs to make a certain amount of money and you say, okay, great, I'll help you sell it. And anything I sell it for over what you need, I'm keeping it. Is it illegal?
No.
No, but it is highly frowned upon.
In North Carolina.
It's not, nope, not illegal in North Carolina. It is highly frowned upon and could become illegal if you utilize it incorrectly. But there is no rule outlawing it even in North Carolina. You just got to be careful. So it is frowned upon, has a look of impropriety, not technically illegal. What's an open listing?
Where you hire several firms to list your property.
Yep, and you're only going to pay the one who brings you a buyer, and what else?
They can sell it themselves and not pay anybody.
There you go. They can find their own buyer and not pay you nothing. What's puffing?
Exaggerating your marketing.
There you go. Exaggeration and marketing. Prettiest view of the golf course, best house on the ocean, you know, most scenic route, yada, yada, yada. That's okay. But the second that you go way above and beyond that and you are a liar, liar, pants on fire, it becomes a misrepresentation or fraud. And a protection agreement. What is a protection agreement? Very important. Nope. This is where this class sucks. They are so close in words, but they're so different in meaning. The protection period and the protection agreement, vastly different.
You're talking about when you sell, you have 3 days. Is that what you're talking about?
Mm-mm.
I don't remember.
Oh, I got it.
Protection agreement helps with the expiration of the agreement. It extends it.
That's the protection period. Also called the extender clause, also called the tail clause.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
This says not an agency agreement, compensation agreement used by a buyer agent to secure commission if property is procured directly by agent buyer's client. Often utilized in conjunction with for sale by owner transactions.
There you go. A protection agreement, folks. Remember, I said if you are a buyer agent and you're reaching out to a for sale by owner, number one, you'd have to disclose your agency status at initial contact, but you're going to ask them to pay you. Would you pay me my 2.4, 2.5, 3%? And if they agree, you're not going to rely on just a handshake. So you're going to ask them to sign this protection agreement. Now, in North Carolina, I told you the formal name for it is the Unrepresented Seller Disclosure and Fee Agreement. It is Form 150. I don't know that they'll test it as such, and they'll just call it a protection agreement most likely. But it protects the seller for understanding that they are not represented, even though you may assist them in facilitating the transaction. And it protects us and our money because the seller has signed a document promising to pay us, even though we don't represent them. Protection agreement. Huzzah. Huzzah. No, not huzzah, Kirsten. No huzzah. No, we're not huzzahing. Okay, I'm sorry. No huzzahs. Which leads us into... Oh, what you got, Josh? You got a question?
What is it also called as? The protection agreement?
Unrepresented Seller Disclosure and Fee Agreement. I don't... If it's in the I'll show you a picture of it real quick, or, you know, the copy of it real quick if I can find it in like 2 seconds while you're just wrapping up the notes here. If I can't, then I'll make no promises, but let's see.
Is it also referred to as the for sale by owner disclosure and fee agreement?
Sure, sounds good. The reason I say that, Josh, is because some textbooks have like there's abstract names that we don't necessarily use in our state, but because there is a national test, that's probably a term. It's just not one that I'm super familiar with. I'll give you an example. In a lot of states, they use a term. This is a different document, but they'll call something a sandwich lease. We don't use that term in North Carolina. And so sometimes I will like jump on like YouTube Lives with a friend of mine who does like national tutoring. And so she'll like ask me questions and try to stump me. And so that was one of the questions she asked. She's like, what's a sandwich lease? And I'm like, I don't know. Why would you ever, like, would you like to rent my sandwich? Bring it back in a couple hours. I need it later, right? Like, there's a lot of terms that are not used in our state. And so that's not one that I'm super familiar with. But it sounds like it fits it. So if you read it in the book, yeah, same thing.
No, I didn't read it in the book. No, I just Googled it.
Oh, yeah, there you go. I mean, it would basically be the same thing. Yeah, sometimes we just use different verbiage in different states. And so, you know, sometimes I know all the verbiage for all the different states. Sometimes I don't, because I only teach this class in North Carolina. Give me 2 seconds. Let me see if I can do this.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was doing some of the work through our portal today, and one of the questions asked if the state and the national questions would be mixed on the test. I was under the assumption that you would get a national test and then you would get a state test.
You do.
Is that not the way so it's not mixed?
No.
The questions aren't mixed.
No. No, I'm not saying that you're not going to see like national concepts on your state exam. You know, because there are some things that bleed over into both. Like there's insurance questions on both. There's, you know, agency questions on both. But you're never going to get a question on Rule 58A.0104 specifically on the national side, or, you know, rules on the North Carolina Residential Property Disclosure Act on the national side, or, you know, the North Carolina Condominium Act. So they're bifurcated, which means two parts. One is a national test, 80 questions. One is a state test, 60 questions. Both for us and the state licensing exam.
Okay, that's what I was under the impression.
Yeah, that's what it is.
What page is the definition for protection agreement on? Or are you able to just say it one more time so I can write it down?
Yeah, I was trying to show it to you. Give me 2 seconds. Let me see if I have a copy of it. And I'm not. I mean, really and truthfully, Josh, it's going to be tested as a protection agreement. If you look in the syllabus, that's what they call it. But I just wanted to see if it was in my...
I just found it.
Okay. It should be in here because they're testing you on it, but I'll find it later. It's not popping out to me in this list of all these documents. 150, 150, 150. Yeah, it's not in here. I'll find it later and I'll show it to you. But yeah, there you go. So let's get into the next big thing, folks. Now, as we're going along here, we're not getting any less testable. Agency is extremely testable. Agency contracts, extremely testable. Basic contract law is what we're getting into, extremely testable. And then financing, also extremely testable. The problem is, though, when you first get into this class, of course, everything is an abstract thought to you, right? You get in here and you're like, I've never heard any of this stuff. This man is talking a different language. I am losing my mind. And so we have to spend a little more time kind of holding your hand and helping you understand things in the beginning. At this point, I've hopefully dumped so much crap into your brains that it's starting to kind of make some sense and starting to kind of combine with other thoughts in your head. And the point I'm trying to make is, I'm not able to slow down, even though these are extremely testable and still somewhat complex questions. The good news is, agency, you don't have enough things to relate to in your life a lot of times, because you may or may not have had an agency relationship and it may or may not have been done right. Contract law, you have enough life experience, most of us, to be able to tie it into certain things. So these concepts are a little bit easier to grasp, if that makes sense. So let me start off asking you a question, as I like to do, to get your minds in the right headspace. As we get into, right, Jacob, you're out of luck. Not enough life experience yet, man. Sorry. I'm kidding. You'll be fine. Let me ask you the question. Is real estate the only people that use contracts? Are we the only industry that use contracts?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Right? And so you've got to understand that. I'm trying to get your minds right, folks. Do not answer contract questions thinking about real estate unless they make it about real estate. Yes, this is a real estate class. Yes, you're working to get a real estate license. But a lot of these questions are just going to be on some very basic concepts, as the name implies. Whether a contract is enforceable, whether it is valid, whether it has the right pieces, whether it doesn't. So this whole section is about basic contract law, contracts in general, how they're interpreted, things that you need to be aware of. Yes, we will talk about real estate contracts, but there's different types of questions. Contracts based on basic contract, questions based on basic contract law, questions based on real estate contracts in general, and questions based on very, very specific documents, like the exclusive right to sell listing agreement versus the exclusive agency, like the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T versus a different sales contract. Everybody okay with that statement? So with basic contract law, it is a generalized interpretation of how contracts should be handled. And so we've got to talk about, things that are required of contracts, what makes them enforceable, what would make them not, and some terminology that we use, and what happens if you do not adhere to a contract. So let's just start with the definition of a contract, okay? And the definition of a contract is it's very telling. There's some very key components. They kind of give you some insight. And then I'm going to make another very important and powerful statement, as I like to do. So a contract is a legally enforceable promise or set of promises between legally competent parties supported by legal consideration to do or abstain from doing a legal act. And if you don't uphold your end of the bargain, then there could be a remedy if you breach. Okay, that's a contract. Now, folks, let's go ahead and make something abundantly clear to all of you. Contracts only matter in one place and one place only. Where?
Our commission contract.
Court of law?
There you go, Misty. I saw you mouth it, Misty. I was just waiting for you to unmute and tell me, right? Misty, folks, I always joke. Have I given you my CIA joke yet? I haven't. I always joke in this class because I just watched Misty go, and I could read her lips saying court and court of law, but I just waited on somebody to actually say it out loud. And so here's my joke. Zoom has gotten me so good at reading lips that here's what I've decided, that if I ever get tired of teaching real estate, I am going to go work for the CIA as a professional lip reader. So listen, 30 years from now, if you see me with some binoculars and an earpiece at a little cafe in Paris, France, looking at a helicopter up on top of a high-rise building, talking into my ear, saying something like, the drug deal's going down at 7 p.m. on Thursday. There's going to be 20,000 pounds of cocaine, right? Mind your business, because I'm a professional lip reader now, because everybody likes to mouth the answers and not unmute. And I've gotten very good at reading the lips. Now, here's the funny part about this. I'm probably not as good at reading lips as I think I am. It's because I know the answer, so I know what you're trying to say. So it's going to be like one of those situations where you're lying on your resume. And I'll get there and be like, they said the banana case is hidden under the elephants. Like, you sure that's what they said? That's exactly what they said. Who's the professional lip reader here? Okay? I think it's code for something. We got to break it. I'm not as good at reading lips as I think I am. But maybe one day. Folks, contracts only matter in a court of law. They do. Because, let me ask you a question. If you and I signed a contract right now, and I didn't do what I said I was going to do, what the hell are you going to do about it?
Take you to court?
There you go. If you're not willing to go to court, what the hell are you going to do about it?
Nothing.
Nothing. Unless you want to square up in the street slick, there ain't nothing you can do about it. Contracts are worthless unless you're willing to go to court. That is the whole purpose. A contract, folks, do people break promises all the time?
Yes.
There you go. A contract exists so that if somebody breaks a promise, we can get some type of remedy, or we could take them to court to enforce that promise. That's the point. But if you're not willing to do that, then contracts mean nothing. And they never will. That being said, folks, there are certain promises that we deal with in a real estate contract. Promises between a seller, promises between a buyer. Do you ever think that there's times that maybe one of the parties doesn't get everything they were promised in a real estate transaction? It happens. It happens. And you've got one of two options. Suck it up, buttercup, and close on the house, or take somebody to court. And if it's something minuscule, you're probably going to do what? Suck it up, buttercup, and close on the house. If it's something big, you may go to court, but understand that's the point. Now, the big telling words here, enforceable, that's what we want it to be. We want to be able to take it to court and enforce it if you don't uphold your end of the bargain. The parties have to be legally competent. We have to have legal consideration, and there has to be for a legal act. Now, these are very important, although not quite where the valid, the criteria of a valid contract, I'm going to hang tight on that. But let me make one more word of caution. Do not confuse this with deeds. We talked about deeds. Deeds had to have legally competent parties. Deeds had to have some type of consideration. Although we said with deeds, it's very more often abstract. Doesn't have to be cash. Doesn't have to be stated on the deed. You just have to know that there was something of value. There's legal capacity. There's a whole lot of similarities because these are both legal documents. And we're even going to talk about valid, void, and voidable in this section, just like we did on deeds. But please understand that if you're answering a question on deeds, that is a vastly different question than contracts. Everybody okay with that statement? So let's talk about some things that contracts can be. This is verbiage that is very testable. Okay? Well, one of the words you've already heard, express. What is express?
Verbal.
Stated. Be cautious with just verbal because orally spoken is express. Written on paper is also express. Either way, it has been discussed. So express means we have stated it, whether it be orally or written. Versus implied. Remember, implied is suggested by our actions. Folks, I want you to think about this, okay? If you go out to eat, have you ever sat down at a restaurant and then they walk over to you and they say, "Good evening, sir and or madam. Welcome to restaurant. Here is a menu. Upon reviewing the menu, you will tell us what you desire to consume and we will take it back to the kitchen. The kitchen will begin to prepare it in a timely manner and we'll bring it to you. Upon the completion of it, we will bring it out to you and you will eat it. Upon your completion of consumption, we will bring you a bill that we expect you to pay in a timely manner plus gratuity." And then they hand you a contract and ask you to sign it. Has that ever happened to you? No. It is implied when you sit your tuchus in the chair and start eating your fajitas and drinking your margaritas that you know you're going to have to pay for them at the end. That is an implied agreement. Now, here's an important thing to understand, folks. A lot of people get so caught up and they think, Oh, well, verbal agreements aren't enforceable and implied agreements are enforceable. Neither of those statements are true. You don't believe me? Next time you go out to eat, try to get up and walk out without paying. See what happens to you. That's an enforceable agreement. I promise it is. You're going to be out on a list, and the cops are going to come follow you home. So express means stated. Could be in writing, could be verbally, but we have stated what we are agreeing to. Implied is suggested by our actions. You did this, so I'm assuming you know that we're going to do that. Like a restaurant. Now this last note says, all transfers of an interest in real estate must be in writing. Folks, we've already talked about why. The statute of frauds. North Carolina has a statute of frauds. Every state has their own version of a statute of frauds. And what that states is certain things need to be in writing and to be enforceable in a court of law. Not all contracts are on the statute of frauds, but contracts for the sale of real property are, which is why they have to be in writing to be enforceable. But not all contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable. We're going to talk more about that in a second. Well, the next thing that contracts can be, folks, is bilateral versus unilateral. Now, let me help you out here, because we all probably are comfortable with the fact that bi means two. Yeah. Yeah, and unilateral, uni means one. A bicycle has two wheels, unicycle has one wheel, okay? But a lot of people get caught up and they think, oh, two parties versus one party. No. Folks, you cannot have a contract with one party. The hell kind of a contract is that? You know what a one-party contract is? That's a Weight Watchers contract, right? I'm swearing this time I'm going to get it together, girl. I'm going to sign this thing. No more cheesecake for me. I am holding myself accountable. This is going to be hung up on the fridge. You know how worthless that contract is? After a couple of drinks that night, I'm going to shred that thing up, pretend it didn't exist. What the hell contract are you talking about? I'm going to eat the whole damn cheesecake. Watch me. Watch me do it. Contracts cannot, will not, and won't not be between one person. So you got to keep it straight. Contracts have multiple people. So when I say bilateral versus unilateral, we mean promises. A bilateral contract is a promise for a promise. A unilateral contract only has one promise. I want you to think of unilateral of if this, then that. Let me give you an example. I'm going to give you a simplistic example to understand a unilateral contract, and then I'm going to give you a very big real estate example. If my neighbor's teenager is out in his yard mowing his father's lawn, and I look at him and I say, hey, if you mow my lawn, I'll give you $80. That is a unilateral contract. Because did that neighbor promise to mow my lawn?
No.
No. But if he did, I promised to do what?
Pay him $80.
Pay him $80. You see how that works? That is a unilateral contract. If this, then that. If you do this, I promise to do that. But there, if is very different than I promise. If he promised to mow my lawn and I promised to pay him $80, that is a bilateral contract. Because that is a promise for a promise. Well, folks, I want you to think about this. In a sales contract for real property, is it a bilateral or unilateral contract? In general.
Ask the question again, I'm sorry.
In a real estate sales contract, in general, is it a bilateral or unilateral contract?
Bilateral.
I would say bilateral.
Bilateral. I promise to give you money, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, and you promise to give me a house. There are promises for promises. Think about an agency agreement, folks. Is a listing agreement bilateral or unilateral?
The listing agreement is unilateral.
Is it?
I'm going to say bilateral because you're representing them and you're going to help them for money, compensation.
For money. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I promise to put forth my best efforts to help you sell your house, and you promise to pay me if I do. Bilateral. Promise for a promise. We promise to put forth our best efforts. You promise to pay us. Buyer agency agreement. We promise to help you find a house. You promise to pay us if we do. Most contracts are bilateral. Most. Now, there's some nuances to this. I'm going to tell you about a very important and testable unilateral contract in just a second. What you got, Jacob?
I'm a little bit confused by your example with the kid mowing your lawn.
Okay.
Because all of these kind of fit that. Like, because the sale of a home, it's also the agree. It all just kind of depends on how it's worded, right? You could say, I'll give you $120,000 for your house.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be unilateral, right?
You've got to understand exactly where this ends. If I say I'll give you $120,000 for your house, that's not a contract, Jacob. That's an offer. If you say I accept, well, understand you're not getting $120,000 right this second, and I'm not getting a house right this second. We form a contract and we have made promises, but there is what we call performance. Performance is getting to the point of doing those promises. So in that example I gave with the kid mowing the lawn, if he promised to mow my lawn and I promised to pay him, we have made promises to each other. Doesn't matter that it hasn't happened yet. But if I just said, if you mow my lawn, I will pay you $80. And he says nothing. That is a unilateral agreement, because could he at any time come mow my lawn and I would have to pay him $80 because I said I would. It'll make more sense as we get into the actual contract formation piece. Don't get so caught up on it yet.
Yeah,
Yeah. We'll get there. You have to understand we're just telling you what contracts can be. I'll give you more in-depth discussions on how contracts form and the actual promises therein. Now, folks, here's the reason why this is important. You are going to get a lot of basic contract law questions on your test. I promise you are. And those questions may say something like, a buyer and seller have entered into an agreement to sell the home, and it's set to close on this date, and, yada, yada, yada. And so it may give you different options of, like, what would you consider this contract? And it's going to use all this verbiage. So it may be like a, valid executory unilateral, voidable executory bilateral, bilateral express. It's going to use these terminologies, and you're going to have to be able to piece it into these examples of, okay, well, is this contract express? Yes or no? Is this contract bilateral? Yes or no? Is this contract valid? Yes or no? And so all of this terminology will get used to build up. Now, don't get so caught up on the it hasn't been done yet piece. It's, have we made promises to each other? That's all this takes. I promise to put forth my best efforts, and you promise to pay me if I do. Or if I ultimately come down to it.
And that's bilateral.
That's bilateral because we have made promises to each other. Let me give you an example that will hopefully help you with this. We have in the real estate world something called an option to purchase contract. And so in an option to purchase contract, I would go up to you, Jacob, and I say, Jacob, hey, listen, I really like your house, and I think I'd like to buy it. How about this, Jacob? Would you sell me your house for $600,000? And you said, yeah, I would do that. I said, okay, how about this, Jacob? I'll give you $3,000 to give me a month to decide if I want to buy your house or not. And if I decide to buy it, I will buy it for $600,000. Are you good with that? And you say yes. Now, did I promise to buy your house? No. I said, here's some money. Give me this period of time to think about it. But if I decide to buy your house did you promise to sell it to me for $600,000?
Yes.
Yes. That is a unilateral.
The emphasis is the if.
If.
Okay.
If. There's no obligation to do anything in a unilateral by the one party. If I decide to buy your house, you have promised to sell it. Unilateral contract.
But you did promise to give him $3,000 up.
I did, because that is a separate agreement. That is the consideration for the option agreement. Now watch what happens though, Sam, because you're onto something here. Yeah, in order to have this option period, I gave him money to have that period of time, because it's kind of like a contract within a contract. So that option period is unilateral. But guess what? If I then say, all right, Jacob, I've made up my mind. I am going to buy your house. Our contract gets upgraded to bilateral, because now I promised to buy and he has promised to sell. You see how it changes? So it can start on this if, but when I decide, it's called exercising your option to purchase. If I decide to exercise my option to purchase or utilize my option to purchase, now I've promised Jacob, I made up my mind, I'm buying your house. Jacob's already promised to sell it to me, so now that I promised to buy it, we are now in a bilateral agreement. That's all it is. Bilateral is 2 promises, unilateral is 1 promise. That's it. Now, I will tell you, options are the most testable version of unilateral, hands down. And I'm going to talk about options a little bit more in depth in the, next section, the contract section, as we kind of, get to it. But the most testable version of a unilateral, hands down.
Options deal with land purchases, correct?
Options can deal with anything. They're very commonly associated with land purchases or commercial deals. But you'll find in just a moment, Tim, that some states work very differently, because options, they're going to sound kind of familiar in a little bit when we get into another concept. But yeah, very commonly associated in most states with commercial deals and land purchases.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So don't ever get caught up on, the parties, okay? It's still 2 parties. Now, I'll give you some more insight into this when you come back from your next break, because, yes, you've already made it there. So come back at 8:40, and we'll keep talking some fun contract stuff. So, talking about basic contract law, this generalized interpretation of contracts, how they work, what they can be, all these different things. So we're starting off with the verbiage piece, okay? So we've got these express versus implied. We've got bilateral versus unilateral, okay? Bilateral being 2 promises, unilateral being 1 promise. Still 2 parties, okay? Still 2 parties. Don't get that confused. So in a bilateral contract, there is a promise for a promise. I promise to do this, you promise to do that. Don't confuse that with it's already done. Contracts are the promise. What we call performance is the actual thing that comes after you form the contract. Okay? So bilateral, 2 promises, unilateral, 1 promise. That if, right? If you do this, then that. Right? If I do this, then you promise to do that. So let's introduce some more words, some vocab for basic contract law. Okay, let's talk about executed versus executory. Okay, executed versus executory. You've heard at least the word executed before. Now let me give you some insight here. Executed under basic contract law means you have fulfilled the purpose. So if we were talking about a contract for the sale of real property, when the seller gives the deed to the buyer and it's recorded and the buyer gives the money to the seller, it's been fulfilled. That is what we call an executed contract. You have completed the purpose. Executed. Executory is a contract that remains to be completed. So in other words, yes, we have an agreement, but we have not fulfilled that agreement yet. And so once we get under contract, there's that period of time after we get under contract to closing. That is what we would call an executory contract. Now, this is where I told you, you'll have test questions that say, Seth entered into a contract with Adriana to buy her house. It's closing in 6 weeks from now. what type of contract do they have? It is an executory contract. Or maybe it'll be, he purchased her house by way of an option to purchase agreement and this, that, and the other. And so it would be a, unilateral contract and a valid agreement. They're going to ask you questions and have you identify these different terminologies. Now, I do want to provide some clarity for some confusion. We'll call it a misnomer, although technically it's not. Sometimes executed is used, or to execute means to sign. And so let me explain what I mean here. It is not uncommon in the real estate world when I send over an offer as a real estate agent to a seller or the seller's agent, that the seller will sign it and they'll send it back and they'll say, here's that fully executed copy of the contract. Well, folks, if I just sent that offer over, do you think the contract's been fulfilled? Probably not, no. So what they were trying to say is it's been signed. So to execute is to sign. They're not ever going to use the term execute or executed on the test. They shouldn't as signed. But be very cautious of context clues, right? If it says that, Stephanie was to execute this, agreement with the response to her, offer, it can mean signature. But if you're just reading executed, it means completed, fulfilled, donesies. We've done it all. Executory means we do have a contract, but we haven't done it all. Okay, things left to be completed. So executed versus executory. So here's where we get into the same terms that we used in the deed section. Valid, void, and voidable. And so let me help you out here. A valid contract is a contract that contains all the essential elements of a contract under basic contract law. There are 4. Now, if you ask a law student, they'll say there's way more than 4, but for the sake of this class, there are 4 essential elements of a valid contract. I'm going to get to those in just a second. So if you have all the essential elements, it is presumably a valid contract. And a valid contract is presumably enforceable, but it's not guaranteed to be enforceable. When I say enforceable, it means you can take it to Judge Judy and try to force it to happen. Okay? That is what that means. So valid means it contains all the essential elements, but even something that contains all the essential elements could sometimes be voidable, could sometimes be unenforceable. And so let me just go ahead and start explaining and giving some examples of these. Voidable is where a party to the contract would have a right to get out of the contract. And so a very common example of a voidable contract would be, just like the deeds, a contract signed by a minor. Because they do not have the mental capacity to contract. They are not of legal age. They could get out of that contract. That makes it voidable. So here's the example, okay? If 12-year-old Justin Bieber came to me and offered to buy my house, and him and I entered into a contract for the sale of my house for $6 million, I can't back out because I am an adult of legal capacity, 18, sane, and sober. But Justin Bieber, who was a minor at the time, could back out because he was not. He did not have the legal capacity to contract. So the fact that one party can back out, consider it not a thing, that it makes it voidable. Does that statement make sense for everybody? So a void contract is a contract that's not enforceable on either party. It's really the same as having no contract at all. And so let me give you an example of what would be void. Very important to keep this separate because you will have to distinguish between, was this voidable or was this void? So let's go back to some of the earlier conversations we had about Britney Spears. When Britney Spears was in her conservatorship, she lacked the legal capacity to contract. It was taken away from her by the courts. So if you had entered into a contract to buy Britney's house, it would be a void contract. A contract entered into with a mentally incompetent person is void. Always void. It's not enforceable on either party. Toss it out. It really has no legal standing. A contract for an illegal act, because that's what you're going to see in a second, is you have to have a legal purpose, as we outlined in the definition of a contract. So if I was to look at Manoj, and I say, listen, Manoj, listen. I'll give you 100 pounds of crystal meth if you murder somebody for me. Well, folks, there is nothing legal about that contract. And let's say Manoj and I are stupid with a capital S, and we even put it in writing and sign it. That's a void contract. It has no legal enforceability on either of us because it lacks an essential element of a contract, because it is for an illegal act, no legal standing to enforce it. It's void. And I want you to picture this. If Manoj goes and kills somebody for me and he comes to me and he says, all right, Seth, I did the deed. Where's my crystal meth? And I'm saying, listen, Manoj, I am so sorry. I smoked it all, man. It's crazy. I'm still alive. I did it all in one night, too. 100 pounds of that stuff, Manoj. I don't even know. Sorry, man, I ain't got the money. Folks, if Manoj goes to court to try to force me to pay him, he's going to jail, right? It's not. They're going to be like, oh, yes, sir, come right this way. Let's take a statement for you on this contract for crystal meth and murder. Now, let me give you some real life advice here. Number one, don't ever hire anybody to do that. Number two, if you're going to do that, don't you dare double cross the person who murders people for a living. You better pay that man, okay? That's just some really dark real world advice. But I want you to understand something. Don't get confused here. A void contract can be completed. Manoj could have murdered that person and I could have gave Manoj 100 pounds of crystal meth. We just completed a void contract. Doesn't mean it can't be completed. Void means never enforceable in a court of law. We really didn't have a contract, but it doesn't mean that we can't do what we promise each other. So when we're talking about valid, before I give you any more examples, let's talk about the essential elements of a valid contract. This is where I will remind you, are all the contracts in the world real estate contracts? No. So the 4 essential elements from a testable point of view for a contract to be valid, right here. We have to have agreement. Folks, every contract in the world is voluntary. If I look at, pick on, whoever, I feel like I picked on Kingsley. If I look at Kingsley and I say, Kingsley, I'll give you $5 for your house. Folks, we don't have a contract, do we? Because Kingsley is not going to agree to that. I made Kingsley an offer, a rather poor offer. You cannot enter into a contract unless both parties agree. So you have to have agreement. Now, from a testable and real estate class world, of course this has multiple names, multiple ways that they will discuss agreement. So you could refer to it as agreement, mutual agreement, mutuality of assent, reality of consent. It's got a lot of different names. But at the end of the day, we have to have a meeting of the minds. We have to agree. Okay? So there's piece number 1. Piece number 2 is consideration. Just like deeds, there has to be something of value. Now, for a contract, it typically is money. But it could be a car for a house for a pool, a this for that. You know, it doesn't matter, but there has to be something of value. Have to have the legal capacity to contract. 18, sane and sober. And then the last one is for a legal purpose. The contract cannot contain any illegalities, or it would not be a valid contract. Hence the crystal meth example I just gave you. So let me give you a few more examples to understand this. If I signed a contract with Kirsten, and Kirsten was going to, I'm going to use air quotes here, buy my house for $0. And we put that on the contract, and we were set to close in a month from now. And a month from now, I don't show up on the day of closing. And Kirsten's mad about it, and Kirsten says, I'm taking this man to court. She's going to go to court, and it's going to be in writing, and they're going to say, well, let me see the contract. And on the consideration line on the purchase price is going to say $0. And the courts are going to look at Kirsten. They're going to say, you want us to force this man to give you his house for free. And Kirsten's going to say, mm-hmm. And they're going to say, get the hell out of here. Because it lacks consideration. It's not valid. It is missing an essential element. If you promised to donate something to charity and then backed out and didn't do it, it makes you a terrible person. But they can't force you to because you were doing it for free. There's no legal obligation to do these things without consideration. Now, if Kirsten and I's contract, folks, had just $1 on there, it would go to court. Because then it would at least have consideration. Now, is she still probably going to lose? Yes. Most of the time, the courts don't really get into what is reasonable compensation, but of course, $1 is probably not something that most judges would force me to sell for, unless they just really want to go after me for stupidity. So these are the essential elements for a valid contract. Folks, notice what is not on here in any way, shape, and form.
An expiration date?
Well, not even that. It's even more. It's writing. Folks, writing is not an essential element of a valid contract. Under the statute of frauds, certain contracts do have to be in writing in order to be enforceable. But what that means is everything that is not named on that statute of frauds could be an oral agreement and still be valid. Now, is it harder to prove in court that we had a verbal agreement? Yeah. Is it stupid to sometimes rely on a verbal agreement? Yeah. But could it still be valid? Absolutely. So, valid, void, voidable are going to be testable in a couple very similar kind of lights. Valid is going to have all the essential elements, but if it has all these things, let me explain this to you, okay? I go to Eliza and I say, Eliza, I'd like to buy your house for $600,000. Eliza, do you feel good about that? Just give me a head nod. You cool with that? $600,000 for your house? Yep. Yeah. Okay. All right. She's like, higher, Seth. More money. Okay. Eliza's cool with it. All right. $600,000. Now, here's the other question, Eliza. Are you at least 18, insane, and sober? 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? Let's say that Eliza is 18, sane, and sober, and hey, listen, depending on the day, so am I. So now we've got an agreement. There's money involved. We have the legal capacity to contract, and can we all agree that money for a house is legal? So Eliza and I have a valid contract now for me to sell or buy her house for $600,000. And this is an oral agreement. It's valid. But in North Carolina, it is not enforceable in a court of law unless it is in writing because it is for the sale of real property under the statute of frauds. So even though it's valid under basic contract law, in North Carolina, it's actually void. Unenforceable on either party. Does that make sense? Now, don't confuse it. Eliza and I could still go through this transaction. I could meet her at the attorney's office, give her $600,000. She could sign the deed over. Once again, it could be completed. But if I don't show up to buy her house, can she take me to court over it? No. Because it's a verbal agreement.
It's unenforceable, right?
It's unenforceable.
Does it keep doing my video?
I don't know, but you're muted.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm fussing at
Sometimes I like to just warn people who have a tendency to forget. So in case you start, screaming profanities at your video, I can mute you tentatively.
Seth, there's a statement in this book
Yep.
that I think is pretty good. It says the statute of frauds concerns the enforceability of a contract, not the validity.
It does. And so here's the interesting thing. It's funny how this works. a group of instructors that I'm friends with, we were having discussions because we're, all members of a educators association. We're that cool. And so another instructor friend of mine posted this in a chat group we have the other day and said, hey, has anybody ever actually read the words on the North Carolina Statute of Frauds? And we all just kind of sat there. He's like, here's the weird thing. I'm sure we've all always taught it as unenforceable. But in North Carolina, the verbiage actually states void. Now, of course, it's semantics at that point because void is just an unenforceable contract. Toss it out. It has no legal standing in a court of law. And so that's a great statement, right, Misty? It does, under basic contract law, it could be deemed valid. But in our state, it's completely and utterly unenforceable because we said we will not hear it in a court of law unless it was in writing because it was on our list of things. And the list: contracts for the sale of real property, leases in excess of 3 years, deeds, promissory notes, restrictive covenants, just to name a few. So, what you got?
I think I missed contractual capacity.
18 sane and sober. Legal capacity to contract. Yep. I'm sorry, Josh. I just saw your comment. What would make an oral agreement valid if there is no record of the agreement? Well, that's the thing. If you have no way to prove it, why waste your time in court? So is it a good idea to have just an oral agreement, right? If Josh, you and I just make a deal and there's nobody around to witness it, there's no text messages, there's no nothing, it's probably not going to go well in court on either part. So, it's very hard to enforce. But could you take it to court? Sure. And just waste our time and money. So the biggest examples of voidable, folks, a minor signing a contract would be voidable. The other biggest example of voidable would be drunk as a skunk, high as a kite. Not of sound mind at the time. And we kind of talked about this a little bit with deeds. And so I want you to picture this. If I was wasted and offered somebody $1 million on their home and got under contract, I don't even have $1 million. If I could prove that I was wasted at the time that I got under contract, I could potentially get out of it. That would be voidable by me who was intoxicated. But the person who signed sober presumably would not be able to get out of it. So that makes it voidable. So drunk as a skunk, high as a kite, voidable. Minor, voidable. If it is for an illegal act, void. Missing an essential element, void. Somebody who's been declared mentally incompetent, void. You will have to differentiate those on the test. Those are very, very important. So when we're dealing with contract formation, I told you, you could have an express agreement, meaning stated or in writing. Of course, if it's a contract for the sale of real property, it would be in writing to be express. And then, of course, it could be bilateral or unilateral. And then implied as suggested by our actions. And, of course, implied agreements for real estate would be unenforceable because they would not be in writing. Now, furthermore, agency agreements are not allowed to be implied either. We talked about implied agency agreements, and I said those are not recognized in North Carolina. But they are recognized in some states. Some states, your actions could create an agency relationship. They could entitle you to compensation. Not North Carolina, though. We can only operate under actual express agency agreements, and we can only get under contract with a written agency agreement. So let me ask you a question. See if you're with me here. True or false? Barbara is so excited to be purchasing her condo at Kerr Beach, North Carolina, that she stops off at Sea Witch Cafe for a couple of Long Island iced teas prior to signing the offer to purchase and contract. This would automatically void the contract. Is that true or false?
False.
I'm gonna say false because a couple Long Island iced teas ain't gonna get nobody drunk.
Is there,
That ain't
She's
necessarily true.
drunk either, right?
is there alcohol in this Long Island?
Yes, it is extremely alcoholic.
Yeah,
But it doesn't
I'm
I
sure.
don't know about you guys, but I'm a lightweight.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of people that are lightweights. Folks, remember what I said.
False.
Drunk as a skunk, high as a kite, voidable, not void. That word makes a difference. This said it's void. That's false. It is voidable. The person who had the Long Island iced teas could potentially get out of it by proving that they were under the influence. It would be voidable. It is that specific on the test. Let me explain why. Now, one of you made the statement, which is not necessarily true. A couple Long Island iced teas ain't going to get nobody. There are some lightweights out there, okay? Listen, I could probably drink 20 of them and still run a race, all right? I'm a big old man. But I have seen people who have one and they are trashed. And so here's the reason why drunk as a skunk, high as a kite are voidable. Imagine that you were sitting by the pool sipping a Mai Tai. And you're looking on Zillow and you find your dream house. So you call up your real estate agent and you go see it after a Mai Tai or two by the pool. And you put an offer in on this house and you get under contract. Folks, is there a good chance that you were fine and you knew what you were doing after a couple Mai Tais? Sure. So we wouldn't want to invalidate the contract, but here's why. We have to make it voidable. Folks, have you ever, listen to me, okay, listen, and don't you lie to yourself. Have you ever had one of those nights where you wake up the next morning and you say, I did what? There's pictures with who? And you don't remember a lick of what you did the night before? And that's the point. Folks, we're not going to automatically invalidate the contract if you can hold your liquor and you were fine. But there are people who do not remember anything they did after a few drinks. And so that's why you could potentially get out of it. If you could prove that you were not of sound mind, it is voidable. But we're never going to automatically invalidate or void a contract because of drinks. Does that make sense?
Yes, Corey, okay.
Is it the material, Corey? Is it a headache? Is it a...
No, it's a combination.
Combination, yeah. I know, man. I know. It's a lot. I'd like to tell you something motivational, Corey, but all that comes to mind is wait till financing. I know, that's not helpful in any way, shape, and form. I'm sorry, Corey. I wanted to be like, it gets easier. It's all downhill from here. I'd be lying to you, Corey, though. I like you too much to lie to you, okay? I'm not going to lie to your faces. So, yeah, there you go.
I think, Steph, I'm trying to understand reading the word and the questions carefully. Like you said, there's key statements you got to read in each question that will fit in either direction, though.
Yeah, and that's why I'm being so thoughtful and emphasizing these words and telling you how these questions are going to look on the test, because I have been doing this for years, and your brains just, like, this is on you, and you're like, oh, I can answer this. But I'm telling you, don't answer it because you think you know the answer. You've got to really analyze every question and find the most important pieces. That word is something very different from valid, is something very different from voidable. And we're going to be testing you on the differences. So that one word made this a false statement, right? If it had said this is a voidable contract, then it would have been true. I mean, quite literally, 4 letters, ABLE, that changed the entirety of the question.
So Seth, in reality though, since our test is multiple choice, we really aren't going to have true or false, right? It's going to be, this contract would be...
Right, but valid, void, voidable, and something else are going to be your answer choices. But yeah, you're not going to have any true or false. I mean, you may have something like, which of the following would be a true statement? So that's not a true or false. And so then there'd be, I mean, arguably. Yeah. Yeah. So void contracts, folks, I told you the most testable examples of void: missing an essential element, like being for an illegal purpose, and somebody who has been declared mentally incompetent by the courts. Somebody like Britney Spears and her conservatorship cannot contract. Toss it out. It has no legal standing. Doesn't matter that one person had the capacity to contract. If your grandmother has dementia and you go and you trick her into signing a deed over to you, folks, it's void. It's not your property. That person doesn't have the ability to do that. So those are the two main examples of void. Been declared mentally incompetent. It will use that terminology, or is not of their own in charge of their own affairs, or for an illegal act or missing an essential element. All of those are void. Okay. So under the influence, drunk as a skunk, high as a kite, potentially voidable. A minor, voidable. Now understand timing comes into play here too. Because if you wake up the next morning and you see that contract and you wait 3 months to go to court to try to get out of it for being drunk, they're probably going to lose. They're going to say, you had 3 months to tell us you were drunk that night. Why'd you wait so long? Same thing too. If you're a minor about to turn 18 and then you turn 18 and it's been 6 months since you turn 18 and your contract's still going, you're not going to get out of it because timing matters with these. So you have had to have been that thing at the time that you signed. And then the longer you wait from that, the more you've invalidated your right to get out. Not for void. There's no timing on that. Let me give you an example of void in the real world. Okay, it never happened to me personally, but another friend of mine worked at a firm, and there was a lady sitting at desk duty. Remember, I explained desk duty. You answer the phones. You're sitting at the front, just trying to get leads. And a man walks in and says, "I'd like to go see this house." And the woman says, "Great, I'm off desk duty in 30 minutes. I'll take you to go see it." And so she did. She took him to go see this house. He liked it. He put an offer in on it. And he got under contract. The next day, a lady walks into the office and she says, "Hey, I'd like to speak to the manager here." And the manager comes down and he speaks to this lady. She's like, "I've got an issue. My father is under my care. He has dementia or Alzheimer's or something. And I noticed in his checkbook that he had written a check for a due diligence fee, yesterday and had the memo for this office." And so basically what ended up happening was she relayed to him that he was mentally incompetent. Well, folks, that contract, toss it out. If the seller refused to give any deposits back, you could easily take them to court and the judge is going to say, "No, idiot, give them their money back. You didn't have a contract." There's no winning this. If you can prove that this person was mentally incompetent or declared mentally incompetent prior to them signing that contract, toss it out. Now, once again, timing matters. If you sign a contract to sell your house, you get in a terrible car accident and you sustain brain damage and you can no longer operate on your own, your contract still stands. We're not going to void a contract if you get mentally incapacitated after you signed it, because you signed it with sound mind. Timing matters. So how about this one? Minor who's almost 18 years old signs a contract to sell real estate. This would render the contract which one of these, folks?
Void.
Voidable.
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 Yeah.
Minors, drunk as a skunk, high as a kite. Voidable. Voidable. So
I thought that minors can't buy or sell property.
Here's the thing. Let's say that you were 15 years old and your parents passed away and they left their house to you in the will. They're going to give it to you. You can own that house. But it's a really slippery slope, and this is where attorneys need to get involved because because of it being voidable, most people do not want to enter into a contract with a minor. But it is possible for a minor to be in a contract. Now, it's a very different thing if you've been emancipated, right? That's different. And this is where, some nuances from state to state come. Well, I'm not even going to say that because that's going to confuse you on your test. Toss it out. But, yeah, you can sign a contract as a minor, but you can get out of it, which is why nobody wants to contract with a minor.
Oh, see, that makes sense then. I was under the impression that, a minor cannot purchase or buy or sell real estate. I thought that you had to be 18 in order to do so.
Well, It's not legally required for you to be 18 because, once again, you know, I mean, you've got these celebrities at 12 years old having tens of millions of dollars. What are you going to do? Tell them they can't buy a mansion? They got the money. Their money spends just like everybody else's. It's because nobody wants to contract with minors because they can get out of it. There's a big risk. There's too much paperwork. It's a pain in the butt. You also don't want to take advantage of somebody who doesn't know what the hell's going on. So that's why it's kind of a thing. But it's voidable, okay? They have the right to get out of it if they change their mind. But let's say that this person turns 18 and doesn't back out. They probably don't have a right to back out anymore because of timing. Now understand that this says to sell real estate. So the minor owns the property. Maybe he inherited it. Maybe he bought it. Who knows how he got it. But he wants to sell it. And so it would be voidable at his request. If he changed his mind, he could go to court and try to get out of it. The buyer couldn't because presumably the minor or the buyer was 18, sane, and sober. So let's keep going with some of these other thoughts here in the time we got left. I told you that the contracts, just like other legal things, do have to have some type of consideration. Now, understand this is a quick little note because I'm going to touch more on this in a little bit. But in North Carolina, we typically use a contract that utilizes what we call a due diligence fee and an earnest money deposit. Please understand that while that is money, it is not the consideration that's required for a contract. The purchase price is. Meaning that if you have a contract with no due diligence fee and no earnest money deposit, it's still very much an enforceable contract because you have consideration, the purchase price. Does that make sense? So we'll talk more about that in a moment when we get into an actual sales contract. So let's add in some more verbiage here. Now this is where, folks, I'm going to be honest with you. If you go down the rabbit hole of Googling these terms, you can confuse the hell out of yourself. Yeah, that's right, Stephanie. We don't do that, right? Do not Google these terms. Look in the textbook. Ask me. Be very cautious because there are some terms, as I said, that some states use a certain way and some states use another way. Here's an example of this. Okay? When we're dealing with addenda, which is the plural of the word addendum, and then we've got this other word, amendment. Let me tell you what I mean. In North Carolina, the way that we utilize the term addendum is an add-on to a contract. In other words, we've got this contract document that we can utilize to assist our clients, and we can fill in the blanks. We're not writing this contract, but we're filling the blanks on this pre-printed contract. But this contract may not address everything that we need it to, so we would add on addendum, add on a supplemental document called an addendum to discuss other things. So in North Carolina, an addendum is an addition to an offer that will become part of the initial contract. Other states will discuss an addendum to be used exactly like we discuss amendments. So just keep that in mind if you ever go down any Googling rabbit holes. But an addendum, the plural of which is addenda, if you're adding multiple, you would say I've added multiple addenda to the contract. It's an addition to the initial offer. Okay? An addition to the initial offer. And so we've got the lead-based paint hazard addendum, an FHA financing addendum, a vacation rental addendum, a short sale addendum, a signatures addendum. It's just our contract doesn't address certain things, so we added on these supplemental documents to the offer that become part of the original contract. Everybody okay with that statement about an addendum, the plural of which is an addenda? And you're going to see examples of this. Don't panic. This is not the only time. So now let's compare that to amendment. You've heard the term amendment before. Where? The government. The amendment to the Constitution. The amendment to the Fair Housing Act. The amendment to the Residential Property Disclosure Act. An amendment is a change to a legal thing. That is an amendment. So when they amended the Constitution, they added stuff to it. Here's what it was. We added this. But don't confuse it, because this document existed and then we made this change. An amendment is to change an already in place legal instrument, like a contract, like a law, like a piece of legislation. So if we get under contract for, me to buy Stephanie's house, and I'm going to buy it for $400,000. And then, I have an inspection and I realize that there's some issues I want repaired. And Stephanie and I agree that we will reduce the purchase price to $395 so she doesn't have to do repairs. Well, we've already got a contract, an executory contract at that. But we can amend the contract and change it from $400,000 to now $395. An amendment is a change to a contract that's in place. A change to an executory contract.
That if there is a mistake in the contract and we want to correct it, that's going to be amended to the contract.
Yes, but that is a very hard thing for me to answer because it depends on the mistake, right? If you're like, oops, I accidentally put $430,000, I meant to only put $400,000. You're under contract at $430,000 because that's how contracts work. Now, if the mistake is I spelled my name wrong, you would just put a strike through and make sure everybody acknowledges that change. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So it depends on what it is. But remember what I told you, contracts have to have mutual agreement. So if we get under contract through the promises, the agreements we've made, and there's something that needs to be changed, both parties have to agree to make that change. Can't just be like, oops, I meant to say. Nope, that's not how contracts work.
An example would be, a couple of nights ago, you mentioned that there was like a closing credit, or you use an example where someone could negotiate a closing credit. That would be a form of an amendment.
Well, if it's part of the initial contract, it's not. You could ask for that closing credit as part of the contract. But let's go back to Stephanie. Stephanie's HVAC doesn't work, and so she has agreed to give me a closing cost credit. We could amend our initial agreement where I was getting no closing costs covered, and now she's agreed to give me $4,000 in closing costs. That would be changing our initial agreement. That's an amendment.
You'd be getting screwed. It costs more than $4,000 to get a new HVAC.
I'm assuming that it just needs some repairs, not replacement, right? Because you're absolutely right. You're talking $7,500 for the smallest unit on a good day, especially for dual zone. Yeah, more closer to 10 nowadays. That's right. Who had their hand up just now? I'm sorry, you put it down too fast.
Oh, I did, but
okay.
I get it. I was just gonna kind of clarify very simply. It's, basically just an addenda or an addendum is a change to what you actually agreed on, saying
an amendment. You used the wrong word. You said an addendum. An amendment is a change to what you agreed on. An addendum is an addition. Here, let me show you this.
Legislation when they added on that you can't discriminate based on familial status.
That was an amendment to the Fair Housing Act, is what you could call that, right? That was a change to that legislation.
Yes, because initially it was based on race. Right.
Yeah, originally it was race and color only, and that was under the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And then we've, expanded and gone on to that. We're going to get into that in a little bit as well. But yeah. And so let me give you all a visual. What you got, Dora? I'll answer your question while I give you this visual here.
So how is this different from a counteroffer? Can you
Because once you're already under contract.
There you go. An offer and a contract are exceptionally different. An offer is we have not agreed yet. But an amendment is we're under contract. That's why I keep saying it is a change to an executory contract. We have a contract. We have promises. We have obligations. But we are agreeing to change it by way of an amendment. A counteroffer is, no, I don't like that, but I would consider this. One is a precursor to the other.
Okay.
Yeah. What you got, Sam?
So are offers always oral or are they written?
They're written. We're about to get into that. They're written. I do want to show you this. Where is this thing at? And I can
Is this North Carolina exam or national or both?
both. We are still under basic contract law, but just be cautious because in North Carolina, we interpret addenda very specifically to be an addition to an offer that will become part of the contract. But on the national side, some of their stupid ASS questions use these terms interchangeably, and it makes me crazy. So, but these are both I'm sorry, my kid's doing crazy stuff. I didn't freeze. I'm not a robot. There are both terminologies, as you can see, on both the national and the state portion. But in North Carolina, you've got to interpret it exactly as I'm telling you. On the national side, you've got to be very careful with questions that give these both as answer choices. Because for all intents and purposes, I actually took, folks, Pearson VUE is your testing provider now. I took the Pearson VUE practice exam a couple months ago that they provide, and they did exactly what I just said. They kind of use these terms interchangeable, which is why I like to caution you about these things. I have seen them. So if both answer choices are there, be very careful. But if it's North Carolina, it's very clearly an amendment is a change to an already in place contract, and the addenda is part of an offer that becomes the contract. And I'll show you what I mean. I found it. We're going to get into this in the next section. This is a very specific sales contract that we utilize in North Carolina. It's that offer to purchasing contract standard form 2T that I've referenced a couple times. Now, I'm not teaching this to you yet, but I want to show you something. There is 17 pages of things that are discussed in here. As you might imagine, sometimes we need additional discussions. If you do, you would attach an addenda right here. I could attach this addendum, this addendum, this addendum, this addendum, and I would send it over with this as part of my initial offer. Here's my offer. My offer includes not only this document, but this document and this document and this document to discuss supplemental things that are not discussed on the contract. And when you accept my offer, you are accepting all the terms of these add-ons, these addenda as well. Now, once we got under contract, let's say that we wanted to change, as I said with Stephanie, the purchase price. We would use an amendment to come in here and change this purchase price from $400,000 to now $395,000. We made a change, amendment. We added something on as part of the offer, addenda.
And so addendum or addenda are always completed at the time that the contract is being written.
In North Carolina, yes.
In North Carolina.
That's what I'm saying. I'm telling you, on the national, and I don't know why. It's so stupid. But on the national portion, they will test them as meaning basically the same thing. They will say that you can use an addendum to make a change. I don't know why. But in North Carolina, without a doubt, it's what I just told you. And so, but I'm telling you, on the national portion of the exam, be very cautious about amendment and addenda questions because sometimes they treat them the same. And if they put both answers on the question, they are sick and terrible people. You know, once upon a time as an instructor who, you know, learned North Carolina stuff and taught North Carolina stuff, I lived in my happy own little like box of comfort. And then being the, you know, education director and being a member of, you know, other organizations, I expanded my knowledge to see how we compare to other states so I could better understand the national. And that opened up a Pandora's box of, I hate this. Why do we have two portions of the exam? Because there are so many things that contradict each other from state to state. And it's so stupid to even test you on that level. But, you know, I don't write the rules. I just have to help you pass.
Yes, that's very true. It's not like we're going to leave North Carolina and go to Texas and practice, or go to California and practice. You can only practice in North Carolina.
Correct. And I mean,
It's a little odd.
here's the problem, though. There are some states, like for example, I'm currently sitting in Georgia. Because of my experience in North Carolina, I could fill out some paperwork and pay a fee and have my Georgia license this week. Some states will allow you to get your license through what we call reciprocity because you have a license somewhere else, so they'll just give you one. Sometimes they only make you come in and take just the state portion because you have already passed a national portion, which is what we typically do in North Carolina if we recognize any of the things that you've done in your states. But yeah, I mean, I don't know why we have that. You know, it's just driven me nuts because of some of the things, the concepts that contradict each other. Let me introduce one more term for the night, and then I'll just let you chit-chat with me as I have a tendency to do. Okay, another very important contract terminology. It's called a contingency. A contingency, folks, is basically a provision in a contract that says, well, if I can't do this, I'm not going to do that. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card. Think of it that way. And so there are financing contingencies. There are loan contingencies. There's no one-size-fits-all for contingency, but it's basically a provision in a contract that says, well, if I can't do this, I'm not going to do that. That's all a contingency means. And so let me give you an example. A financing contingency may say, well, if I can't sell my house, I can't buy your house. And so if I can't sell my house, I want to get out of buying your house with no penalties. That would be a contingency. It's called a contingent sale agreement. Me buying your house is contingent on me selling my house. Contingency. A more common old school one was a financing contingency in the like loan type. You know, this is contingent on me getting a loan for 5% interest rate or better at a term of 30 years. And so if the interest rate is over 5%, I would get out and I said, nope, not buying it. It was contingent on me getting this exact loan percentage rate. That's all a contingency is. It's a get out of jail free card. If I can't do this, I'm not going to do that, and I don't want to be penalized for it. Are they common? Absolutely not. What you got, Sam?
So in that case, like if I need to sell my house before I can buy your house, or if someone had to sell their house before they could buy my house, could I up the due diligence on them because they're riskier? Or is that contract and due diligence already put in place before?
I know, Seth. I know.
Hold on. Here's the thing. The whole point of a contingency is to get out of jail free. And so what that would mean is, in a typical context, is that you wouldn't even want to forfeit your due diligence money. And so asking for more due diligence money, if we write up something that says that we can get out with no penalties, does you no good. But that is a very, very specific thing that would depend on the exact contract and the way it worked. But could you deny the contingency in general? Sure. Could you say, I'll give you the contingency, but I need more due diligence and only the earnest money is refundable? Sure. There's no one size fits all for the contingency, but it would be something that would have to be put out in your offer. It would have to be outlined from the offset that you wanted a contingency. There's never a contingency by default in any contract. It would have to be drafted and thoughtfully added in. What you got, Jacob?
So you said that contingencies aren't common?
No.
Oh, I thought I heard you say that, and I was like,
No, I did say that. I was reiterating that. I did say that. They are not common. So I was saying, yes. No, they are not common.
Really? Because I would say that probably 70% of our sales are contingent upon the sale of their own home.
No, they're not.
New construction.
He is in new construction, but I'm going to say this again. No, they're not. Your builder is not accepting a contingency. They are disclosing to you that they have a home to sell, but that's different than being contingent on the sale of their home. Contingent means they can walk away with no penalties. I promise your builder is not doing that.
We are.
That's asinine.
I swear we are.
No, I would bet money that you're not. Giving them the ability to walk away with no penalties, there is no builder in the history of ever that has done that on a contingency. There is this understanding that they have a house to sell in order to buy, but that's a disclosure, not a contingency. I would double check this week, Jay. Like, I'd be interested to know. If you are, that's interesting.
I mean, yeah, I'm happy to double check if you're curious, but I mean, we are. We're doing contingencies to sale and contingency to close. We do that very, very often. I would say more often than not we do.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, we're not going to go that. Like I said, it's very uncommon for contingencies to fly. For builders, for sellers, for everybody. Think about it. Why would let's take builders out of the equation. If you walked up to a seller and say, well, I want to be under contract on your house, but I'm just going to screw you over and walk away with no penalties if I can't sell mine. Does that sound like a deal that a seller wants to take? No. So, I'd be, yeah, who knows. What you got, Adriana?
Well, if the seller don't want to take that risk, can he accept other offers?
Of course. Every offer is just an offer, and every contract is, remember, voluntary. So if you send me an offer with a contingency, Adriana, here's what I'm going to say, right? You're going to send me an offer, and even if it's a good offer, and you say, well, Seth, I want to sell my house first, and if I can't sell my house, I'm not buying yours, and I want to get out with no penalties. I'm going to read your offer, and I'm going to go, she wants me to accept her offer. No.
Because once you accept that offer, more than likely somebody's going to come along that has no contingency that wants to buy your house, and then you're screwed because you've accepted.
Because you're under contract, right? And then you can't accept that other offer. So contingencies, it's part of the offer. It would be a request, and just like any offer, just like if I said, Adriana, I want to buy your house for $1, you can tell me to go to hell. If you send me an offer with a contingency, the seller can tell you to go to hell. Say what?
So you can accept the offer and tell that.
No, if you don't want the contingency, you can't accept that offer.
Oh no,
Okay, different question. Okay.
Accept the contingency. Can you tell the person that, well, but just in case, I will continue to get other offers, but then you would explain to the second person in line of the, that is offering, that you are waiting for the financing part. I'm sorry if it's confused.
No. I get what you're saying. You're going down a rabbit hole, though. But then also be aware that, there's a nuance from state to state. Other states have what we call a kick-out clause that does that. They can get under contract, but under the terms that if a better offer comes in, they will give you an opportunity to match it or kick you out, and they will sell it to the next person. North Carolina does not, cannot, will not, won't not have a kick-out clause. Because when we're under contract, we have promised to sell to you. We cannot back out as a seller. So if you want to consider that there may be better offers coming in, you just don't take the contingency. You just deny it and never accept that offer.
Oh, I got it. Do they still?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Adriana. Do they still have backup offers?
Yes, backup offers are still a thing. Yeah. But they're not fantastic, but they do still exist. Yeah. Folks, we got lots more fun things to talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow we will finish up the basic contract law discussions, and we're going to move into the North Carolina specific contracts, okay? So that we go from basic contract law, and then we switch gears and we start talking about that contract I showed you, certain forms that are very testable in North Carolina on our individual sales contracts. And then we immediately just, switch gears and start diving into some of the other crazy stuff. And it does really just move faster and faster and faster. I mean, you can tell this section we're not spending nearly as much time on. Basic contract law is extremely testable. We're almost done with the basic contract law conversation. It's just how it flows. But there's another big piece, which is the getting under contract piece. How do we move from an offer to a contract is what we're going to talk about in great detail tomorrow, because that is extremely testable and extremely important. Any questions, comments, concerns in the last minute? On a side note, I hope you saw I went into Zoom, I downloaded the links, I put them in the chat as I said I would. So you have the undoctored, unprettified version of your classes. So if you need access to them to study prior to me prettifying them up and putting them on YouTube, you have them. I will try to do the same thing with last night's and tonight's.
You said those are in GroupMe?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think Justin, you saw him, right? Because somebody, was it Justin? Was it Josh? One of you liked him, and so you saw. I think it was Justin. Yeah. Because it was midnight, right? And I'm like, oh dang, look at Justin being awake still, just like me when I posted him.
Yeah, I saw him. I was still up studying, so I saw him.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so they're in there. So if you have any issues with them, let me know. Yep.